Morning.
Morning.
Morning,
Dan.
Dan.
Morning.
Christine, are we getting close to a quorum?
I'm still collecting names. I think we are.
Good morning.
Morning, Sylvia. Dan, I know we have some members that have intermittent conflicts, so they'll be in and out a little bit today. I will send you a list. So for the minutes, we'll just put partial for some of our members that have had to step out. Okay, we have a majority of the ASCAC present, so we can begin.
Just as I managed to get my mouth full.
Very sorry about that, Dan. Or we could wait a couple more minutes.
No, it's fine. Well, I'll say what I've said for what seems like forever. I keep hoping that we are going to have a real live meeting with real 3D humans, because I think we all miss the informal conversation that takes place around these meetings. And that's the one thing that is really hard to do with this Zoom model. So, I thought we were past some milestones this summer, and here we are in the middle of Delta. So hang in there, and it will eventually happen. Other than that, I really don't have any new news to share, other than I'll hand the floor over to Barb to sort of give us an update from Germantown.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Good morning, all. Let me share my slides, and I'm sure you'll all tell me if I'm doing this in the right way. All right. What do you see?
Works.
My slides, or do you see the presentation?
We
I
actually
got it
see the
right.
slides.
All right. I'm going to do something a little different this morning. As you know from my last presentation just a month ago, I have 2 new division directors, so I'm going to share my time with Ben and Jaron today so that they can actually give you an update on their program. So I'm going to give you kind of a high-level update and then an update on what's happening in the advanced computing technology division, and then turn it over to Jaron and Ben. Normally I end with this slide, but I wouldn't make a smooth transition, so I just want to call your attention to a couple of things. Rob Ross was named a Lawrence Award winner last year, and he's going to come this afternoon and give us a talk. And we're going to have our standard exascale talk. As you all know, Sandy Landsberg will be giving us an update on the COV tomorrow. And then we're also following on Mary Ann's talk from last time with another talk on diversity, equity, and inclusion, this time from the Computing Research Association. So with that, I'll slide to the next slide. I have a new announcement. As of Monday, Jordan Thomas, who was our AAAS, one of our AAAS fellows last year, has actually joined OSCAR. She's going to lead our Leadership Computing Challenge program. She helped Christine with this last year, as well as helping roll out the Office of Science's Pure Data resource that I talked about at my last meeting. Prior to that, she was a data analysis for analyst for a small company, and she's actually a physical climate scientist with a background in global climate modeling and simulation, which shall be a great benefit to Oscar. And she's fulfilling the role that Carolyn Lazan did. So she'll be coordinating across all of the facilities rather than focusing on one facility, plus helping us out getting Oscar's message out with communication. We also have, and I neglected to mention this last time, but Bill Miller is joining us for a detail. He's actually currently employed at NSF, but he's joining Oscar as a detail to kind of strengthen the connections between the two. Bill at NSF is a senior science advisor for the Office of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure and the Computer Information and Science Engineering or SCIES Directorate. And he fosters new CI-enabled discovery pathways in science and engineering, and he's actually helping Ben out, and I'm sure Ben will talk more about that, but he's actually serving to help us with our requirements review. So I think it will, like I said, strengthen the connections between NSF and DOE Oscar program. And with that, we have updated our org chart. I even updated it more than what was on the web, because if you go to the web, unless it changed overnight, Jordan was still up in Ben's box as a AAAS fellow. She's now down under the Oscar Leadership Computing Challenge. The thing to note is we still have a lot of people, certainly, Ben, Jaron, and myself in acting roles. I'm currently the acting division director for the Advanced Science Computing Technology Division. And certainly Jaron and Ben have to backfill their own positions, but we hope to fill those positions coming up and have some new positions. I mean, we still remain to be shorthanded with what we need to do going forward. With that, I'm just going to turn to, there's been a lot of news about what Congress is doing these days. So I just wanted to give you a quick update of what these bills might mean for Oscar and the Office of Science. Certainly there's been a lot of talk, especially in the last 2 days, about the reconciliation bill. That's the $3.5 trillion bill that was passed. But the House has not taken it up yet. It was passed by the Senate, and in that there's $7 billion for construction projects. Of that, there is for Oscar programs in ECP, NERSC, ALCF, OLCF, and ESNet, our facilities, about $1.3 billion. There's another line in the Office of Science language there for about $1.4 billion for major items of equipment, and that includes for Oscar about $300 million for a data facility, which I think I talked about last time. And there's another $200 billion for research, development, and demonstration activities, and there Oscar has been the Computational Science Graduate Fellowship is in for $116 million, and there's overall the Office of Science, there's $340 billion for activities to facilitate access of researchers to U.S. quantum computing facilities. Now, the thing to note about these numbers is technically they're for the fiscal year 2022 appropriations, but they last until 2026, so that when you see $116 million for CSGF, you have to divide that by 4. And that, again, if you want to go and read more about the bill, you can go at this link I have here at the House. The other thing that they're talking about in tandem with the reconciliation bill certainly is the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, which is about $1 trillion request. Now that passed the Senate in August, and it included about $550 million and new federal investments in American infrastructure. This is roads, trains, waterways, etc. There isn't anything in there for the Office of Science and Oscar particularly, but they do have tens of billions of dollars for applied R&D and technology demonstration programs at the Department of Energy, and nearly $3 billion for climate at the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration. The other thing that certainly everybody in the federal government is looking at is the continuing resolution. As you may be aware, the House passed a stopgap funding measure on September 22nd, but it also included the suspension of the debt ceiling through December 16th. The House blocked, or the Senate blocked that vote on Monday night, and so we're kind of waiting to see what happens. The House may come back with a clean bill without the debt limit, a suspension in it, and we expect that, you know, hopefully a clean bill will pass the Senate. If not, there'll be a shutdown on Friday, but never fear, the Office of Science has money to last for a couple weeks, so we'll still be working. And the other thing, as I was preparing for this, it's gone silent on the United States Innovation and Competition of 2021, or the USDOE bill, which was formerly the Endless Frontier. It passed in June. It included funding for the CHIPS Act and NSF research to complete globally in science. The House passed on June 28th corresponding bills. They had the National Science Foundation for the Future Act and the Department of Energy Science for the Future Act also passed. Now, the Department of Energy Science for the Future Act passed in the House contains funding for investments in renewable energies and research in emerging technologies, and invests over $50 million over 5 years in the Office of Science and National Labs. It would boost our budget to $8.8 billion in FY22, and which would be about a $1.8 billion increase over 21. And hopefully by 26, we would get up to a budget of $11 billion if passed. That's across all of the Office of Science. I found no discussion whatsoever on this legislation, so I don't know where it stands. But that's just kind of a flyby of what we're watching this week, what bills may impact OSCAR and the Office of Science, and what bills won't. Vin, you have a question?
It's just in the chat. The question person was, is the 300 million for a high performance computing data facility correct? That was a couple of charts back. You had.
I took that right off of the legislation at that link.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. So now I want to switch from talking about budgets and bills and funding and talk about some other things that are affecting OSCAR and the Office of Science. One of the things we start thinking about at this time every year is what we're going to request, what funding opportunity announcements we're going to put out to solicit proposals from the community. And we have a couple of changes that I want to highlight. Starting this year, we have a new collaborator template that will need to be included in any responses to our funding opportunity announcements. It's actually going to be an Excel spreadsheet to be submitted by the lead applicant that will list all of the collaborators for the individuals that have been listed in the budget sheets or listed in the proposal as senior or key personnel. And we'll use this information like we have in the past to help us manage reviewer selection. And it will be, as I said, it will be requested for all FY22 funding opportunities and lab calls. We're also working with SciNCV to develop a DOE science template for our bio sketches for current and pending support. I think other agencies have looked at this as well. We don't expect to have this ready right October 1st, but we hope to have it ready to roll out in January of next year. And for all of you with ORCID accounts, you can actually link this to your ORCID account and we can pull information from that information, so you don't have to put that data in again. On the along with understanding who your collaborators are and more about yourself, we've had for a number of years data management plans have been required. in our proposals. And we view this, as an integral to our proposal merit review process. And we want to, because they help us enable discovery, it helps us share, preserve, and validate data, and it helps us understand how we need to fund these things. And you'll notice that the third bullet down here is proposals now can include requested funding to implement a DMP, data management plan, which we considered during the merit review. Bent?
I was just reminded of an NSF effort along similar lines, and everybody turned in proposals with their plans, but it wasn't clear whether anyone implemented them. So one interesting question is whether there's somebody checking to see whether plans got implemented and the data actually get saved.
And that's one of the reasons why we've now let the proposals request funding to make sure this happens. And the other thing, the other side of that is we wanted the reviewers to really review this section of the proposal. So in addition to suggesting, we've always had on their web suggested elements to include in the data management plan, and we'll continue to do that. But we're also now going to provide guidance for the reviewers on how to review the data management plan. We want to know if it's suitable and it supports the validation of the proposed research. We want to make sure that the suggested elements are connected in the data management plan, and encourage constructive feedback to continue to make these data management plans further, or to further improve them. But we also, at the same time, to support this work of the reviewers, we're going to have a reviewer training. And so PAMS, which is our portfolio management system, will email to the reviewers. We'll include a link to provide guidance of the reviewers to kind of train them on this, and then they'll have to certify each year that they've read the guidance. Yes, Dan.
I was just gonna, a couple observations quickly. One is, the AAU and a bunch of other university library consortia and others are talking about the unfunded mandates associated with data management plans. A lot of this data is valuable long after a research award ends. And so who bears that cost and at what scale? And then just another thing I would throw out, that I put in the chat is, it would be really great if the federal agencies could converge on some of standards for this, because everybody asks for current and pending, for biosketches, for conflicts, and the standards are all different across agencies.
And Dan, I think that's why we're going to this the SCI-NCV, because I think that's something that other agencies are doing. But I certainly agree. That's why we're providing some funding to maintain the data, because that is important. And if you remember my discussion on PURE, we understand this might roll into PURE at some point. Vent.
So Dan's comment inspires another observation, and that is that one of the successful things about the Internet program was that the Department of Energy and NASA and NSF and ARPA all combined their efforts, and they did so in a compatible way. So they each built their own backbones, and everything was interworkable because of standards, which is something that Dan mentioned. I just wonder whether there ought to be, maybe through NITRD or some other cross-agency, NTSC maybe, or as NSTC, some effort put into building a data management system that people could either make use of or at least connect to and with standards, in the same way that the Internet allowed for a government-wide engagement. Maybe somebody needs to show some leadership building one of these things so people can take advantage of it somehow.
Just hold on to that thought. I think Ben Brown is going to give you one view of what we might be thinking of after this talk. And I'm sure that Bill Miller is taking copious notes about what you've said, because this is a start. So let me switch gears from FOAs and highlight what's going on down south at Oak Ridge. This is just some of the, what you don't see. A lot of times we show you those wonderful pictures of our facility, of our machines, but we don't show you what's underneath of it. So this is just a slide showing that the OLCF is ready for Frontier. The next slide is, yes, we're getting cabinets. Frontier is being delivered. And this is important because the agency, the department had an agency priority goal, as you can see here, to engage in the research and development of a capable exascale computing ecosystem. And I see that my cohort in this effort, Took Wong, is on this. So I want to call out her support that we've had in actually developing the exascale computing ecosystem. But the main milestone that we had to meet in this agency priority goal is by September 30th, 2021, begin deployment, receiving and installing at least one exascale system. That system's at Frontier. You can see the storage systems here, but on the bottom right, you can see the 12 compute cabinets that we got last year. So yes, we have begun receiving and installing the system. April of 2020, at that ASCAC meeting, I talked about the COVID HPC High Performance Computing Consortium. I just wanted to give you a quick update. It's still in existence. We're still accepting proposals. We meet monthly as a board. We provided actually access to the high performance computers by over 100 projects at this point. These are the members as of today of the consortium. You can see when we talked in last April, that we didn't have partnerships with Switzerland, Sweden, the UK, thanks to Tony, connecting us with the right people, Korea and Japan, Satoshi. We worked through him as well. So it's a worldwide consortium at this point, and we're still, like I said, accepting proposals. Just a reminder of what happened. This came together for a few days, over 14 days in March. Again, remind you, there is no signed agreement between the people listed on the last slide. We all came together with the idea that we wanted to help fight COVID. We had our first 100 proposals submitted by May 9th. And as of today, we've had over 213 proposals submitted. We've approved 112 of those. You can see the organizations we're getting the proposals from. And 32% of the projects that we've given allocations to have experimental, clinical, and policy transition plans in place. But for more of what actually happened at Oak Ridge through their investment and their involvement in the COVID consortium, I encourage you to check out Bronson's talk tomorrow at 11. And I just want to, I said this before, since we are still seeing continued impacts from COVID, the consortium is still active, and we're looking for projects and understanding and modeling patient response to the virus in large clinical test beds or large clinical data sets, learning and validating vaccine response, evaluating combination therapies using repurposed molecules, epidemiological models driven by large multimodal data sets, and maintaining mutation understanding and mitigation methods. So we're still here, we're still supporting proposals. I talked to you last month about the task force, and I think every time I will talk to you, I will give you a progress report on the task force, because we are acting on the recommendations of the ASCAC Committee on Transitions, OSCAR after ECP. We've met, and I think we noted that we met at least the first 3 of the bullets under here, but since then we've met with the Computational Research Leadership Council, which is composed of lab division directors, and we're meeting with other science agencies and funding agencies and stakeholders in upcoming meetings. But more importantly, We have an RFI, a request for information, that's currently going through review at headquarters that will release to get community input on what our thoughts are for a sustainability or stewardship model for our software. With that, I just want to focus on a couple advanced computing technology accomplishments from that division before I turn it over to Jaren. I think I've talked about Mendel before. It's software that's being developed at Oak Ridge for AI machine learning. It received R&D 100 award last year, but it's been licensed to General Motors for use in autonomous vehicles for actually doing, will offer the potential to quickly and accurately develop AI models to enable the next generation of self-driving cars. And I'm waiting for that. Robinson showed this slide earlier this week when all the program managers share their ideas for the future, their accomplishments, and then what they want to do next year. I thought this is extremely interesting because I love the little backpack that's on top of the Dragonfly that's collecting data, so you can transform, you know, what he's seeing into hardware. And the diagram down on the left, the red line is what he sees, and you can see as he sees the prey coming after him, how he flies off. And so this is how it's taking images from his brain and translating it into hardware. So I think it's a start. And some of the things that we're funding with neuromorphic funding that we're doing in emerging technologies. So if I turn now, I think I've talked before about the quantum test beds. There are collaborative research facilities that allow the research community to work with testbed scientists to explore fundamental questions in quantum computing research that's not well suited for industry platforms. They offer access to novel quantum processors that are not yet robust enough for commercialization and provide the users with a complete information on both hardware and software. Nothing is held back as proprietary. And so they're designed for foundational research. We have two. We have one based on trapped ion quantum computers, and the other one is on superconducting platform. That's the one at Berkeley. The Q-Scout is at Sandia. Both of these are open to users, as I noted. And they have currently are oversubscribed by 3. They're in their first year of, I think they're ready to start their second year of actually access. But what's interesting is we have dedicated users from both small and large quantum computing companies. Case in point, this is a slide that Claire shared with me earlier this week. We have, this is actually from one of her SBIR topics that we have in SBIR. A small company on the system at Berkeley, helping to improve gate speeds and fidelity, specifically on improving the capability by compiling in a manner better suited to that specific device. So you can see that they've done some, instead of decomposing the Hadamard gate, they've changed how they've done that. So they're also introducing different technologies to make a QT, the test bed at Berkeley, better. So with that, I think that's my last slide, and I will stop sharing and turn the screen over to Jaren.
Thank you, Barb. I'm gonna share my slides. And yeah, you should be able to see this. I'm happy to give a short update from the ASCAC Computational Research and Partnerships Division. And I get to talk about the fun stuff now that Barb covered the and the Congress. So let's see. So first of all, FY21, we executed our budget. We made it. We're at the end of the fiscal year. We put out 12 soul stations and made 129 new awards. we started the year with the early career research program and ended the fiscal year with the Bridge to AI and Privacy Preserving Artificial Intelligence Research solicitations. So the solicitations are listed here in the order of their closing dates. So we continued with our investments certainly in early career and SciDAC partnerships, specifically in basic energy sciences. We made new investments in ASCAC and integrated computational and data infrastructure. Made some awards in quantum networks, but also quantum internet and 5G. We participated in the microelectronics co-design research solicitation. And of course, we made some investments in applied math and randomized algorithms and data scientific machine learning and analysis and data reduction for science, which is really a partnership between applied math and computer science. Again, I don't know that you can see the website at the bottom of my slide, but you can see the list of these awards on our website. And I mean it, it's actually easy to find those lists. I checked it yesterday. So let's see. We continued our maximum telework posture, but that doesn't mean that we were idle. We did have some community events, 8 in total that we sponsored, but of course we participated in other community events. Again, I listed here some, well, the ones that we sponsored, starting on October 1st until the end of the fiscal year. We started with a 6G wireless communications roundtable. And of course, you've heard about the community of interest workshop. You will hear more about the randomized algorithms for scientific computing workshop from Tammy today. And then roundtable discussion on operating systems that you've heard before from Hal in the previous ASCAC meeting, data reduction for science workshop. We continued with the SciDAC annual virtual get-together meeting in the summer. And lastly, we've held a workshop on reimagining co-design and very recently a roundtable discussion on parallel discrete event simulation. The workshop reports, if they're available yet, you can find them online on the link that I provided at the bottom of the slide. But if they're not there, the workshop reports are not ready yet. The other thing that I want to note here is that, and I haven't mentioned it in the slides, we did have a COV that you're going to hear more about from Sandy tomorrow. And I'm not going to provide any more details on that. Okay, so our community, I'm going to provide some highlights from our community and some scientific highlights. Nuclei project has been a nuclear physics SciDAC partnership project that's been going on since SciDAC 2 actually. And of course, it resulted in a lot of scientific achievements, but also apparently it's a catalyst for early career researchers as well. 6 early career nuclei scientists were awarded DOE early career awards. Their projects range from machine learning to dynamics in nuclei to mathematical optimization to ab initio methods. This is of course very interesting and very something that we're very proud of in SciDAC and in the ASCAC research division. Our partnership with the BER continues to result in scientific achievements. In this case, DOE, ASCAC, and BER supported researchers published in a paper in Nature. And these researchers, they contributed in this project at multiple levels. And that includes selecting appropriate climate models, developing model parameterizations, and conducting ice sheet model simulations. Overall, these models and methods were greatly improved, and they provided the most comprehensive projections of sea level rise from land ice to date. Results confirm that Antarctica remains a critical focus for reducing future sea level uncertainty. And there's a specific number here limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius reduces 21st century land ice contribution to sea level rise from 25 to 13 centimeters. So again, this is something that I think a lot of us can understand and use in different projects. The next slide is from the OverQC, which is one of the quantum computing application teams. This work is a little bit maybe harder to understand, but not less important. Again, this was a Nature Communications paper recently published. This work actually constitutes one of the few rigorous scaling results proven for the VQA, the variational quantum algorithms. As you may know, the VQAs are really one of the group of algorithms that are mostly studied for near-term quantum advantage. But this work showed that care must be taken when defining the cost function. And a lot of the studies related to VQAs published in the literature were cautioned to go back and look at their the cost estimates based on this study. Okay, moving on, a couple of highlights from the computer science. The FlexFlow is a framework that leverages the Legion runtime system to provide a significant performance improvement. This FlexFlow and Legion combination provides significant reductions in time to solution and scaling compared to existing methods. One example is that using this approach, the training times in Candle project, they were reduced by 15-fold. Again, this is a collaboration between many institutions, including labs and universities and industry. And of course, it's funded by multiple sources within OSCAR, including OSCAR Research, but also ECP. The next one is about MOCHI project. MOCHI is, again, a collaboration between multiple institutions, labs and universities and industry, and being funded by OSCAR Research and ECP. MOCHI overall has dramatically lowered the cost of building data services. So the team demonstrated the use of MOCHI on multiple occasions, but more importantly, it's being used by teams outside by laboratory and university and industry teams. MOCHI is a finalist for the R&D 100 award in 2021. And many more recognitions related to it. And that provides a nice segue for my next slide, because our community was recognized in multiple ways over the year as well. I'm gonna start with Rob Ross, who is the one of the PIs in MOCHI project, but also a longtime SIDAC PI, Rapids 2 director. You will hear more about him from him actually. I believe today, and he's the recipient of the Ernest Orlando Lawrence Award in 2021. We have other recognitions from our community. Bertie Young, who is the 8QC director. 8QC is one of the ARC projects, Accelerated Research in Quantum Computing. He was elected as AAAS Fellow in 2020. And Esben Eng, who is a longtime SIDAC PI and current FastMath director, he was elected as the AAAS Fellow in 2020 as well. Two other FastMath PIs, Rob Fagu and Habib Najim, they were elected as SIAM Fellows in 2021. And Carol Woodward, she was elected as the Association for Women in Mathematics Fellow in 2021. So congratulations to all of them. We're very happy and to hear about these recognitions that are very well deserved. There are other recognitions here, and the recognition of reaching the retirement, although it seems like the people that I'm going to mention here, they're attempting to retire, but they're not very successful. I'm going to start with Barry Smith. As you know, Barry's work transformed how large-scale software libraries are developed, supported, and used. He is very well known by his work in PETSI, and he's been recognized by many awards during his career, including a Lawrence Award in 2011 and Gordon Bell Special Prize. He's currently a part-time Argonne Associate and Senior Research Scientist at the Flatiron Institute, focused in research on PETSI and the changing future of large-scale numerical simulation. Congratulations to Barry. Tammy. Tammy retired from Sandia. You will hear more from her tomorrow. She made foundational contributions to algorithms and software for tensor decompositions, graph analysis, and data science. Again, she was recognized many times during her career by many awards. She was a PCASE awardee in 2003, and she's a member of the National Academy of Engineering. She's currently an independent consultant and researcher under her own company, MathSci AI. You will hear more from her tomorrow on the algorithms workshop. Last but not least, Phil Colella. He actually retired 2 years ago, but we didn't really notice that he retired because he's much more, still so much involved in our community. But I wanna make sure that we recognize his attempt to retire here. He is, of course, he spent 40 years in LBNL and University of California. He is well recognized for fundamental advances in high resolution schemes and adaptive mesh refinement methods. He's been a very long time Oscar Applied Math PI, and he's a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He is still a part-time employee in Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and continues to contribute to many projects, including an ECP project. Again, congratulations to Barry and Tammy and Phil, and good luck with their attempts to retire. Lastly, I'm going to talk about a little bit about our preview of FY 2022. So I listed here a couple of topics that we are interested in exploring. I'm going to say a disclaimer here. This doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have a solicitation every single one of these topics. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're not going to have any other topics that we may have solicitations on. But our interests in the research division continues on data in visualization and storage systems and I/O. You've heard about the parallel discrete event simulation roundtable that was held recently. We're of course interested in explainable AI, high productivity environments for scientific computing, randomized algorithms for scientific computing. You're going to hear more about that from Tammy, and federated scientific machine learning as well. Mimics and SciDAC partnerships. Most of the SciDAC partnerships, except the partnerships with basic energy sciences, they're up for recompetition. And that is what we plan to do depending on the appropriations in FY22. With that, I'm gonna thank you very much, and I'm gonna pass the baton to Ben.
So Vint, before you go on, Vint has his hand up. I'm not sure, Vint, if you had a question.
Yeah, I did. It had to do with the speed up, that 15x speed up on machine learning, something I'm very interested in. Does anybody have a sort of a nutshell explanation for what contributed to the 15x speed up?
I don't know. So that's the quick answer. So I think we can provide that information to you, and I'm going to turn to Hal if he's actually on the call, and he can maybe.
Yeah, I'll just say very quickly. It was primarily from increased scaling. The Legion is an asynchronous task-based environment that scales out to many nodes and covers both execution on CPUs and GPUs. And they were able to layer FlexFlow on top of Legion to provide this scale out, and that enabled them to scale up the training to a larger number of nodes and thus decrease the time to solution.
Okay, the reference about improvement over TensorFlow is interesting since we're at V5 now on our Tensor hardware. So we'll have to compare notes at some point.
Yes, and please feel free to contact us and we can provide more information and connect you to the PIs.
Thanks.
Sure.
Any other questions before we go on?
Right, just want to do a quick audio check. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. All right, rounding the bend in our tag team presentation, I will present highlights from the facilities division. Can you see my slides?
They're
Yeah.
visible.
Wonderful. All right, and I'm going to watch the clock. So I am going to go fairly quickly and hopefully leave time for questions. At a very high level, before I get into the specific highlights for each of the 4 scientific user facilities, I just want to highlight 3 principal kind of cross-cutting achievements of the last year. First, we really achieved some significant improvements in our ALCC program this year, and I credit to Christine and Jordan for really sculpting a new way of engaging our partner programs within the Office of Science and DOE, with really bringing them into the process. And this has just paid huge dividends for the quality of the process itself and the engagement, the quality of engagement with our partner programs. And I think it's a model going forward that we really want to continue to build on. We also continue to innovate in our requirements reviews practices, which are really central to how we engage with the user community and our stakeholder community to understand their needs and also share perspectives on where we're going. And so I want to highlight also some innovation with the leadership computing facilities, engaging in sort of asynchronous models of requirements reviews with lightning talks, some really interesting ways of doing this in the hybrid work environment on topics for clean energy and advanced manufacturing over the summer and biodefense applications. And then our ESNet science engagement team, who has a really well-honed practice, which really is agile and adapted to the COVID era to deliver a really impactful requirements review for the high energy physics program, and is also rounding the home stretch with our fusion energy sciences program requirements review. And then the third bullet I won't go into now, I'm going to highlight it in the talk coming up in a moment, but I just mentioned that we have this integrated research infrastructure task force that has published a white paper on the topic of how we federate or contemplate different models of federating major research infrastructure. So stay tuned for that in a moment. All right, now I'm going to step through at a clip here, 2 slides per facility. I'm going to preface this by saying I can't possibly do justice to the scope of activities at each of the 4 facilities in such a short format, but I needed to be some measure of equity here. So 2 slides per facility. First at Argonne, just incredible progress this year on both Aurora and Polaris. It's amazing to see the hardware of Polaris going in. I think I may have missed a step with Barb in terms of, I think I had a missed opportunity here to show you the floor in Argonne. So I think what I'll do is I'll put those pictures into my slides to be posted on the web. But it's really, we have similar pictures showing the progress on the machine floor at Argonne, and just really proud of what the team has accomplished this year. And it's thrilling to see Polaris coming in, and that we'll be soon doing tests and hopefully having that available for boarding applications in 2022. At the same time, extraordinary focus on Aurora, and the team has really maintained focus and did exceptionally well with their independent project review earlier this year. It's no small feat. I want to say this in general for each of the 4 facilities during the COVID era. I am truly inspired by the teams and how they've been able to maintain their focus on their core operations with really no major hiccups in delivering HPC and networking resources for the community. And so kudos to what each is doing. So again, there's so many science highlights. I asked the team and Oscar HQ to help put together these slides, and because of these sort of appetizers. Really interesting work coming out of ALCF this year with their quest to model every building, I think, in the US with digital twin. Early science project on the transport of cancer cells in the blood, teaming up for that. Machine learning for light absorption and water photoelectrode interfaces for solar energy research, and a host of really interesting COVID-19 projects across the facilities, but at ALCF, one in particular, with really high throughput analysis of biomolecules for candidate drugs. ESNet, a program near and dear to my heart, as I do have a plan for my backfill, and looking forward to that, but also celebrating the time that I've spent and the privilege of being the ESNet program manager. You can see here on the left, and this really emphasizes the progress in ESNet 6 over the past year plus. And what you see there in that little GIF that just ran is that almost completely during the time of COVID, the project team succeeded in completely building out the new optical network as we live and breathe right now. All of the data flowing on ESNet is on the ESNet 6 optical infrastructure that was formerly this dark fiber that was acquired in the Recovery Act in the 2010 timeframe. Really substantial progress on the software orchestration piece that is critical to delivering the programmability and automation features that are central to the ESNet 6 software-defined networking era. And what that middle piece represents is that they're actually using those tools now in anger to deploy the services. So the people who operate ESNet are actually using these automated services to stand up the new network. And then lastly, on the right, the sort of right column, you see the sort of progress bars, the progress for the installed bandwidth, the installed routers, and the backbone, and a picture of. We don't often take to see like what is it, what does the ESNet gear look like? We're talking about dozens and dozens of data center locations across the U.S. With really close coordination with their remote hands-up folks who install that. And ESNet, of course, has delivered and exceeded their reliability metric for core operations throughout the pandemic. Major contributions to the IPCC, a recent report in supporting the Earth Systems Grid Federation, huge data flows delivered in support of that effort. More really impactful COVID research use cases. I'm going to highlight that specifically actually in the talk upcoming. Working with the high energy physics community and DESI, again, using the petascale, the prior investments in petascale data transfer, just paying huge dividends. And then within ESNet's own innovation R&D shop, two really novel projects that are, really show promise for this ESNet 6 era. One with in-network caching, where they introduced a pilot of storage caches in the network and demonstrated a 3-fold reduction in network usage for certain flows. And also the advent of data transfer service virtualization, their famous data transfer node model. They now have a data transfer node as a service architecture that they've piloted. It's very exciting. At NERSC, Perlmutter, we're on the cusp of, don't want to jinx it, but we're on the cusp of the acceptance tests for Perlmutter. So extremely exciting to see Perlmutter stand up. There was a formal dedication ceremony held in May. It's debuted on the top 500. And again, extraordinary performance by the team to deliver the project during the COVID era, coping with so many slings and arrows. And a really special award, the DOE Sustainability Award for Innovation, an innovative approach to sustainability. I think this is a really interesting milestone in our long quest. Of course, we have so much work to do with energy efficient computing, but what they've done at Berkeley with Building 59 and the operation of the NERSC systems is extraordinary. In terms of science highlights, we've got, again, a panoply. You talk about 8,000 users. It's almost unfair to pick, but we kind of highlighted a few that, again, on this administration's priorities in clean energy and climate, land ice contributions and sea level rise, machine learning for the sky survey. We have the high energy physics community, the coronal mass ejections. We have basic material science research. I mean, I just can't do justice to the span of research that goes on at any of our facilities, but this gives you a bit of a taste for some of the highlights of the past year. And you heard a bit from Barb about OLCF and again, I sound like a broken record, but I'm so proud of each of the 4 facilities. I know the team at OSCAR is for what they've done with our major projects and staying on track. All 4 independent project reviews this year came back without recommendations as a hallmark of how each facility enterprise is really focused on their excellence in project management. Summit continues to deliver a major resource for the community. Frontier, we're on the cusp of seeing racks installed and being tested. And so much of the story for this past year, as you'll hear from Bronson and you heard a bit from Barb, and the HPC consortium and the adaptability of our resources to meet these extraordinary times are other major highlights for the year past. Extraordinary work at OLCF, highlighted by an ACM Gordon Bell Special Prize, studying disease mechanisms for SARS-CoV-2. Work on really tight scale 1 square kilometer average grid spacing for the European model for weather forecasting, a new vector into that space that really shows promise for the exascale era. Work in biofuel solvent deconstitution of biostructures for fuel production. I could go on, and each of these highlights is incredible. I encourage you to click through them and go to our website for additional details. Looking at the time, I'm going to stop there, yield the floor back, and go to Dan for questions to any of us.
All right. I see Vince got his head up, and then we'll go around and see if there are other questions.
Mine has to do with the ESNet 6. I was just curious about what capacity we're achieving per wavelength on the optical fiber for backbone for ESNet 6. Are we at 400 gigs or is it faster?
It's faster. It's generally going to be a terabyte, but it's not a monolithic statement. You're probably familiar that the capacity build out per link is something that's done very methodically on a quarterly basis. So they're really looking at every link and making hard choices across the entire backbone for where to put resources.
You said terabyte. I assume you meant terabit.
Terabit, sorry, yes, terabit per second is the general quote that we give to the scale.
Okay,
You can
thanks.
see that the aggregated installed bandwidth of the backbone spec for the project is 15.5 terabits in aggregate.
Got it. Thank you.
What's a factor of 8 among friends? Other questions? Oh, folks, have another cup of coffee. We want this to be a lively and interactive process. All right, going once and twice. All right, looking to see is Steve here yet?
Yes, he is.
All right, then we'll move on and we'll hand the floor over to Steve, who is continuing to wear a bunch of hats, for which we're grateful. So, Steve, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, good. So, first of all, I want to thank all of the members for their service. As I've mentioned many times, the advisory committees are really core to the way we understand directions and to further develop the programs and so on. And then I also want to especially thank the new members that have joined in this cycle. It's a lot of work, but again, it's very important. It's core to what we do in the OSCAR program. And I spoke before ASCAC in early August, and so what I'm going to focus on today is providing some updates to what I presented in August. So the first topic I would like to discuss is the status of our political appointees. As I mentioned in July, actually it was July that we met. As I mentioned in July, Secretary Granholm has been with us for several months and has been very active articulating the vision of the Biden-Harris administration. She's had the opportunity to actually get out and visit in person some of the labs, and is also in the process of conducting virtual lab tours. She did Oak Ridge, for example, just yesterday. She's very engaged with the program and has been very engaged in budget decisions associated with our FY23 budget process. Also, Dave Turk, the Deputy Secretary, is on board, and we've had an opportunity to work so far with him on a number of issues. I think he also is articulating an interest in learning much more about the Office of Science activities. And we're in the process of providing him with updates on that. And then in July, I reported on the status of our 2 political appointees, Asmaret Berhe, who is a professor from University of California, Merced. She's the nominee for the director of the Office of Science, and Jerry Richmond from Oregon, University of Oregon, is the nominee for the Undersecretary for Science. Both nominees had their confirmation hearings before Senate Energy and Natural Resources in early August and are awaiting being voted out of committee to the full Senate. In our front office, in July, I reported that Tanya Das was our Chief of Staff assigned to the SC front office, and she has recently left DOE to take a position outside the government. And I've asked Adam Kinney, who is on my immediate staff, to fill the position of Chief of Staff on an interim basis until a new appointee can be identified. Also, Natalie Pham, who is a special assistant to the director, will be rotating out of Office of Science in early October into another DOE organization. And we expect there will be a replacement for Natalie forthcoming. Also, as I mentioned in the July ASCAC meeting, the DOE applied energy programs are now back under our undersecretary, and we have been working very closely with them in the preparation of the FY23 budget, which has been sent over to OMB earlier this month. And I'll be able to report more details on all of that at a forthcoming ASCAC meeting after the FY23 budget is released from OMB. Regarding the budget, I believe Barb Helland already covered the details of the Oscar budget request for FY22 and the status of that in the House Energy and Water Development Appropriations and also the Senate. At the top line level, the President's request was $7.44 billion for the total of Office of Science, which is an increase of about $414 million from FY21. The House mark is slightly less than that, $7.32 billion, and the Senate mark is slightly more than that at $7.490 billion. And we're hoping that the conference process will occur soon and that we'll have final numbers to work with. Other items of current interest are, I'm sure everyone has read about the infrastructure and the reconciliation bills. Office of Science activities are not covered in the infrastructure bill. However, there is a fairly significant uplift for Office of Science included in the reconciliation bill. However, with that said, there still are significant negotiations going on in the Congress, and it's too early to predict the outcome at this time. Hopefully, more information on that at some point in the future. As I'm sure you're aware.
Is this LPS or is this somebody else in the University of Maryland? Do you know who at the University of Maryland though?
Eric, would you mind muting your mic, please? All right, go ahead, Steve, please.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So the fiscal year 2021 runs out at midnight tomorrow, and Congress is working on passing a continuing resolution. If a CR is not enacted by midnight tomorrow, I do expect the Office of Science will not immediately shut down. it turns out our appropriated funds, unlike many other departments, do not expire. And we will continue to operate on carryover funds. And I think it's a similar situation at most of the national labs. The other thing that's going on that's really significant that I need to mention this afternoon is the debt ceiling. You may have seen that the day before yesterday, the Secretary of the Treasury notified the Congress that absent action by the Congress, the U.S. government will reach the debt ceiling by about October 18th. And at that point, I think we're actually really in uncharted territory. But I also can say that internally to DOE, we're considering what has to be done if we face a shutdown in that context. So keeping our fingers crossed that something will resolve there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions for Steve about DC politics? Anyone want to handicap what happens in the game of chicken in DC?
It's Vint, and I've been here long enough to know that handicapping is a big mistake. I ain't making any bets, but I'm making sure I got a good bottle of champagne and a good bottle of whiskey, depending on which way the things go.
Probably wise choice. Joking aside, questions for Steve, sort of about where we are.
Since this is Roscoe, since things are changing rapidly, this week and next, will there be a mechanism where we hear from you as things settle out, what decisions were made and so on for the next meeting?
We can certainly do that.
I think that would be of interest, just because it's so open-ended and unknown now. If there's some mechanism that allows that.
Well, let's see. I mean, one way to do that is I can communicate to all of the advisory committees through the chairs. Would be one possibility. Dan, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's fine, Steve, and I'd be happy to push the word out then to the
okay. Yeah, I realize it's a lot of uncertainty, and it just, it's the nature of the times.
Yeah. On the other hand, in the midst of all of this, as both you and Barb talked about, there are some real opportunities for funds that could enable lots of really terrific things.
Yep.
So
I would certainly agree with that.
Other questions for Steve? If not, we will. Yeah,
Steve,
so Richard.
You mentioned that you had prepared the FY23 budget. Are there any highlights or priorities that you can share with the community, with ASCAC at this time?
I can really only comment on the overarching priorities of the Biden-Harris administration. So there's considerable emphasis on clean energy and climate. That's out there in the public. With regards to any particular details of the 23 budget, that information is embargoed until it's released by the White House, which typically, I hope we have a normal year, typically would be in the sort of late January timeframe.
Related to that, Richard, I mean, the members of PCAST, the President's Council Advisors on Science and Technology, were just announced last week. There is a good bit of info, to Steve's point, about the administration's priority that you can find at the OSTP websites. Those are good places to get a high-level sense of where they're hoping to go.
Yeah, in that regard, Dan, PCAST is actually meeting yesterday and today. So that's their first planned meeting. And then I was informed earlier today that they plan to meet on a monthly cadence, at least for the rest of the calendar year. And so I would expect to see a fair amount of information come out of the PCAST process.
I think that's right. Other questions or comments for Steve? All right, Steve, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Dan. And also, again, thank you to all the members of ASCAC. Really appreciate what you're doing for us.
So we are running a little bit ahead of schedule, which is better than what we often do, which is run an hour behind schedule and scramble to catch up. So what I'm going to suggest is that we let Ben talk about Oscar facilities, and there are a couple of questions I think in the chat about accelerators for quantum and interfaces with HPC systems. And maybe after that, we'll take, since we have no break in the schedule today, we'll take a little break after Ben's presentation and then pick up after that. So we'll do a runtime dynamic about that based on how much discussion there is with Ben's presentation. So maybe we'll just segue, and I'm looking, trying to find on the screen. Christine has been here.
I am here. I just wanted to ask, I saw in the chat, Krista, would you like to ask your question before I step into my slides for the next presentation?
Sure, thanks, Ben. Yeah, so my question was regarding the facilities as we prepare for new types of accelerators entering those facilities. For example, with a quantum accelerator, a quantum computer growing to the size of a quantum machine, what preparations or considerations are occurring now for those facilities, since that would be a multi-year journey?
Absolutely. And I think there's a couple things that immediately come to mind. One is that there's already activities going on across the facilities. One in particular, OLCF, is a quantum test bed that's been in operations for several years, and is really, I think, paving the way for building that intellectual engine in-house at one of our facilities. And it's a very collaborative thing in the community, right? Not just that there's one effort at Oak Ridge, there's multiple efforts, and that information is closely shared in our community. I think the other thing that's really exciting is that we have the division that Barb is the acting director of, the Advanced Computing Technologies division, and the test beds, the traditional strength in our R&D prototypes program, and the potential renewal of our approaches to test beds. Barb, I invite you to comment maybe on what you think about this. Some previous presentations, you have a nice slide that sort of articulates the bridging aspect of our three divisions in the future.
Yeah, let me just go back and say at Oak Ridge, it's not a test bed, but we do have access to quantum computers through the QCUP, the Quantum Computer User Program that I didn't mention, so that we can train our support service, our support staff, the scientific support staff, to be able to, support quantum users as well as the other users. But certainly, we hope to, develop test beds so that because I agree completely. We're going to have to connect a quantum accelerator to a HPC at some point. I think that it's a natural partnership. So we want to start looking at that now, looking at the technologies, looking at how we connect these things. And I see Karen there because I think optics is going to be the way that we're going to have to connect the two. So there's a lot of questions out there. But you're right, Krista, that it's something that we're going to have to start now and look at. And we do have not a coordinated program, but certainly have different aspects that we're looking at across the facilities. And I think as we hear more about what we're looking at Nurse 10 and at the other facilities for upgrades following on to exascale, I think you'll see that we're actually looking at some way that we can be more flexible so that we can broaden the number of accelerators that will be on our machines.
On the quantum front, as it is sometimes maybe a distraction or confused with the direction for exascale and HPC, is there a plan or need to communicate the, I guess, limited scope or use cases, or the effects of, like you're saying, the classical to quantum to back to classical use flows that I guess will better frame the perception of what that actually, what its place is in the solution stack?
Yeah.
And-
Oh, go ahead, Barb.
No, go ahead, Ben. I was gonna have Jaron pop in again too, because Jaron has been working with our centers, and I think a lot of this will come out of the centers. But go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say, and I'll turn it to Jaron. Rick, I have a quantum information background myself as an experimental physicist, and I totally get what you're saying. I think the National Academy's report really underscored this, that there's a natural progression at the 30,000 foot view of the evolution of quantum science to quantum technologies to engineered systems, that it's still, we're in this inflection point. We know that. And I think one of the ways we communicate the power of these opportunities is that it's not going to put HPC out of business. It's not that. It's not an or, it's an and. This is an aggregative thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's a theme you'll hear in my presentation coming up. It's about, in the earliest days, potentially, and I'll turn to Jaron, but for example, quantum simulation, right? That's a really obvious thing. You can't, this is what Feynman said. And how do you simulate a quantum system with a Turing machine? You can't. So Jaron, I'd like to add your perspective.
Sure. I mean, just quickly, I'm going to reiterate what Ben said, and we tried to communicate that in our previous discussions to this to the advisory committee, is that in ASCAC and within the Office of Science, we don't see quantum replacing high performance computing, but really augmenting high performance computing. But for the quantum centers that I previously talked about in the advisory committee again, we currently have 5 national QIS research centers that cuts across the technical breadth of Office of Science. We're co-funding them. But one of the things that we emphasized for the centers was the science and technology innovation chain that starts with the fundamental science to applications and encompasses all the steps in between from devices to systems to prototypes. So in all of these steps, the centers are working with different industry partners to make sure that they're looking at each step, but also they're looking at the interconnections between the quantum computing and high performance computing as well.
I think if I get really blunt about it, there's a lot of computationally intractable problems that poorly informed executives will read an article about quantum computing, and all of a sudden they think they got the magic wand to solve the thing that we've been complaining about not having a big enough machine to solve. And this creates a lot of distraction. And I have an internal white paper that I have to use to put out a fire about once a quarter this way. And so I guess what I'm getting at is being the ambassador in a way of the classical high performance computing for the government and across the industry. You're in a great position to make this very clear where the delineations are and the specific areas where quantum has promise, for example, in, like you said, in simulating quantum phenomena, but also then the limitations on it, so that we don't have people, running around trying to do CFD and, other very suitable for traditional modes kinds of problems.
Great. You want to follow?
I mean, I can quickly follow up on that. Within the Office of Science, we see quantum information science as a formidable basic research challenge. So again, and we're excited about all the challenges that it brings to all the other offices other than ASCAC as well. So yes, there's a lot of, I think you're talking about the hype. There's a lot of hype. But I think we do realize some of the hype, and we are a basic research organization. So and we realize that the challenges that it poses to us, they're very exciting and interesting.
Krista?
I just want to, I just very much appreciate Rick's comments, and I just want to underscore that, at Microsoft, we've done extensive studies on the architectures and the applications, and we believe that the you know, the industrial value, the commercial value to come from a quantum computer or as a quantum accelerator to classical HPC or within a commercial cloud, for example, will come only when you get beyond 1 million physical qubits. So to be explicit, right, that value is really coming from a scaled industrial size, you know, quantum acceleration capability. And that's not to say that the research and development, you know, the importance of that along that roadmap, along that path, that is critical. And that's where it's so wonderful to see the investments coming from DOE and other agencies, right, to enable us to get to that point. So thank you for those comments.
Yeah.
Well, Krista basically raised a point that I wanted to make as well. And we're spending a lot of money at Google on quantum computing, as many of you know, and we've been pretty successful. But when you talk about 72 physical qubits on a chip, that's very far away from 1 million. And the reason the 1 million is important is that it might take 1,000 physical qubits to make a solid logical qubit that lasts long enough to do something interesting. And the point that our lead on quantum said to me recently in a public setting, so I can share this, is that you need a couple of wires per qubit in order to control the little bugger. And 2 million wires is not easy to get into one place. So figuring out how the hell to build a 1 million qubit system is a non-trivial exercise. And it led me to realize why the quantum networking thing is so important. Because if you can't build 1 million qubits on one machine, what if you have to build it split up into several machines, but then you got to entangle the machines? And the only way you can do that is with a quantum relay. Guess what? We don't have one of those yet. So, I mean, there's just a lot of work to be done to extract all the horsepower that we're hoping for out of quantum computing. So, you know, you just put a paper bag on your head and breathe slowly. We still need conventional high performance computing to do work for us while we figure out how to build a quantum machine that's worth the effort.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the old saying about a professional baseball player saying, if it were easy, anybody could do it. And this is why we do basic research, is to try to answer these hard questions. Other questions or comments? This is a great conversation. We will eventually get to Ben's talk. Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, if I can just follow on to what Rick has said and others. I mean, we still do get questions from the Hill. Well, why do you need an exascale if quantum is coming? So we continue to push, you know, on saying that we need both. We're going to need both. We're going to need to connect them. So I hear what you're saying, and it's all consistent with the message we've been giving every time we give a talk to OMB, if we give a talk to the Hill.
All right, Ben, now back to our regularly scheduled program.
No, it's great conversation. All right, can you see my slides? Yes. Fantastic.
Yes.
Make sure I can see you. And to the degree you're willing to stay on camera, I've been inspired by your energy. So thank you so much for to Barb and Christine and to the committee for the opportunity to speak with you today. I can't underscore the privilege this is to speak to a vision for the Oscar Facilities Enterprise. Coming up about, not that I'm counting, about 10 or 12 days until I hit my the end of my 1 year mark in this role. And I think Barb's incredibly shrewd that she still has about 12 days to get rid of me if she doesn't like the talk. So, but all kidding aside, this truly is an extraordinary opportunity to share, but really is a synthesis of so many conversations over the last year as I assumed this role, and really my 5 years in Oscar, and actually going back my 13 years in the Office of Science. And on that note, I wanted to start with something, a quick personal note that I think the unusual step of dedicating this presentation to two people in the Office of Science community who we've lost in the last 13 months. Bob Astheimer is a longtime senior technical advisor in the Basic Energy Sciences program. And many moons ago, when I first expressed interest in learning more about our scientific user facilities, the answer was, go talk to Bob. Bob was our institutional memory in the Office of Science in the Basic Energy Sciences program, and was instrumental in forming some of the key insights that I'll be talking about in a moment. And recently we lost David Skinner, a longtime employee at NERSC. And David was special to me because he may have been the first person who told me about the exciting work going on in the OSCAR facilities around linking to experimental facilities, complex workflows. If you knew David, he was so passionate. He just came up to me at a NUFO meeting and introduced himself and started talking about the amazing things going on in the OSCAR facilities. So the OSCAR facilities enterprise that we have today is extraordinary. It is in a position of strength. I've inherited probably the best dealt hand of poker one could ask for stepping into a new role. We have incredible teams, which I'll touch on, at these 4 facilities. We have a great team in OSCAR. We have 4 upgrade projects in flight that are all doing really well, and we tend to them very closely. This is a slide that this is it in one slide. This is the stock and trade slide we've used with describing the enterprise to the transition team, to new political appointees, to new employees, anyone who will have an audience. And I think it's yeah, a lot of text. We do a lot. So we're talking about our user programs touching over 11,000 users per year. All the projects, all the resources beyond the headlining pictures of the bright and shiny HPC and awareness of the scope of ESNet. There's a lot of other services and infrastructure like the storage capabilities that are relied on by the community. And oh, by the way, in that box on the right, we have a really significant mission thrust in advancing US competitiveness. And this makes us a really interesting, underscore interesting enterprise because we have a lot of stakeholders. From a lot of different directions. And I've come to this practice in my first year in this position to following the shiny hardware pictures with this picture, because infrastructure is people, period. All right, the people at these facilities are extraordinary and they are called upon to do Herculean things. And oh, by the way, could be earning mega bucks in the private sector. And I have this little tiny icon in the upper right of the Mars Perseverance rover, just to remind me to take a moment to touch on something. If you're a Disney Plus subscriber, there's an awesome documentary, Nat Geo documentary, on the technicians who built the Perseverance rover at JPL. I wish I had the budget to do something like that to explain the efforts of our teams. But what you come away from in that documentary is how much it is a craft. It is an art. When you are at the bleeding edge of building something to deliver for the nation and for others to use, to hand off to scientists and others, there's no playbook. And that is what is the lifeblood of these 4 enterprises, is the deep intellectual knowledge over decades of hard-won progress that, as long as I'm privileged to be in this role, I will be thinking of them first and those teams there and whether we can, we have conditions for these 4 enterprises to continue to thrive. This is another stock and trade slide of where are we? We're again in a very strong position. Circa start of FY 2022, we have, and with our NNSA partners, a very clear roadmap for delivering exascale systems honed over years of hard work and the contributions of ASCAC in the community. Perlmutter and Corey delivering, on the cusp of Perlmutter delivering cycles, Corey delivering huge, really impactful resources for the Office of Science community, and the dawn of the ESNet 6 era. So again, the top level message is we're in a really strong position. I'm not going to just skip over these slides fairly quickly, but business is booming. user numbers for the HPCs continue to go up. Engagement with industrial partners continues to thrive. That always has an outsized interest on the Hill, especially. And if you look at the, who's using the HPCs, for example, no surprise, it's all 50 states and some of the territories. It's just an enormous footprint. With really diverse representation. Now this, I alluded to at the top, the scientific user facilities in the Office of Science. And this is, again, a stock and trade slide of the mosaic of all 28 that span all the 6 Office of Science programs. So there are the OSCAR ones at the top that we know and love. And this research infrastructure is the envy of the world. We have the most powerful X-ray light sources and neutron scattering sources and electron beam centers for materials characterization. We have the fusion energy platforms, high energy physics, nuclear physics, particle accelerator experiments. The Biological and Environmental Research Program has their atmospheric radiation monitoring facility, the Environmental and Molecular Science Laboratory at PNNL, the Joint Genome Institute at Berkeley for genomic sequencing. On paper, the scale is sort of dizzying. In fact, I even put a link there to decode the acronyms if you care to. But what's the point? The point is that the OSCAR facilities are part of this larger community of practice that is incipient, and then I'm going to touch on it more deeply in a moment. And we really exist in this really rich landscape in the DOE lab system, in the phylum of major research infrastructure, and how that's evolving in the era of this rich complexity that I'll get to in a moment. Of this moment in advanced scientific computing and data intensity is at the heart of the vision that I'm going to offer you. Now, over the past decade or so, and I just mentioned that we've had an internal working group in the Office of Science that just celebrated its 10-year anniversary, and that was maybe the first time I started working closely with Barb and Christine. Is on a project to sort of get our arms around what does it mean for the Office of Science to operate and steward this major research infrastructure. And one thing led to another. We kind of built out the policy framework for what are these beasts. And we decided that we needed to really get our arms around in a much more rigorous way who's using the scientific user facilities. So this chord diagram on the right illustrates the cross linkages in the user community of the Office of Science user facilities. So the OSCAR ones are the kind of dark purple in the upper right quadrant. And the thickness of these bands is proportional to the number of the users who used 2 facilities across the arc. So all the green ones are the basic energy sciences facilities, for example. The major point here is there's a lot of cross-linking, not just within the OSCAR facilities, or not just within the basic energy sciences facilities, but across. And again, this speaks to the fact that this is an interwoven set of infrastructure. And what's really emerging, and what I think ASCAC has put its hands on in their recent reports and the number of recent community reports, is that the complexity of research workflows is the opportunity there to stitch together, to kind of throw the levers of different powerful tools into a research workflow in new ways, is blossoming at an accelerating rate. So this slide represents just one, you can only pick one for the sake of time, that is the Linac coherent light source, the world's most powerful free electron laser, high intensity X-ray light source, which is an exquisite tool for basically breaking down and sort of stop motion the evolution of atoms and molecules and dynamic processes. And what you have here is an artist's rendering of protein crystallography at a Linac coherent light source beamline, the seminal tool that was used recently to address the extraordinary national need of the COVID crisis, in partnership with NERSC and ESNet, not overnight, in a moment, to do real-time image analysis of SARS-CoV-2 virus in the beam at LCLS. The ability to do this and respond to the national need was predicated on years of collaboration between Berkeley and SLAC, and between LCLS, NERSC, and ESNet. And I just want to give the second plug for Bronson's talk tomorrow to hear more examples from the ALCF and OLCF in the COVID era. But I think this just illustrates the power of not just the investments, not just the sort of we proudly state, look at the accomplishment, but of the pre-investment, of the things that are subliminal, the collaborations that are in the community when the people with the expertise start to make those connections and really start to understand the art of the possible. So my first supposition, which I know I'm speaking to those, many of you appreciate this deeply in your bones. Today, we are entering not only the exascale era, but also a new era of complexity in advanced scientific computing. And it's this theme of complexity that I'm going to harp on for the next few minutes. There are several recent ASCAC reports that point to this complexity, and by complexity, broadest brushstrokes, 30,000-foot view, you look at any of these topics, data velocity and volumes, the methods, AI and ML, advanced algorithms, the complexity of scientific software, the new options we have for hardware, even the places that compute can be deployed or sourced, from edge to the cloud, to your campus, to your desktop, to the HPC. there's just we talk about the Cambrian explosion in hardware. I see this as sort of a fractal phenomenon of across any of these things, the complexity is growing, not converging. And that means we're in a position of strength to contemplate new things, but the glass half empty part of that might be so that it's confusing, it's befuddling, especially to those who aren't part of our community and tracking what's possible, or those who are confronting porting their code, or those who have had, like myself as a small lab experimental scientist, they're used to doing it on your own, and you code your crummy thing and you have your workflow and you wire it up and you give it a go for a couple of weeks, you tear it down, you do another thing. The sociological landscape across science is extraordinarily diverse. And so articulating the art of the possible for what is new is complex in that dimension as well. So the next few slides, if you don't take away or pay attention to anything else in the talk, I hope you focus in on these. I'm actually going to read this one. I've scrubbed this slide to it's within an inch of its life. But this is my best encapsulation of sort of the spirit of the moment, because what I see in the Oscar Facilities enterprise is that in contending with this new complexity and entering this new era of advanced scientific computing, first, the practice of science is evolving. Coupling between modeling and simulation, experimental observational data, advanced algorithms, AI, ML tools, this has the power to accelerate discovery and innovation fundamentally. And so where we once focused on batch jobs, queues, bulk data transfer, and decades ago, we have evolved to a state of contending with really rich, complex workflows where you could take any one of those things as a researcher and contemplate fusing, say, AI, ML to your mod sim, or maybe all three, go for broke. You take your experimental data, bring it in, apply an AI, ML optimization to it direct through real time, steer your experiment, have it paired to a digital twin. I know the committee knows all of these use cases. Second, computing technology is evolving along multiple trajectories. General purpose computing is but one market segment. So managing risk and opportunity in our hardware choices is increasingly complex. And this speaks to our relationships with our vendor partners and with our strategic partners in NNSA and the Office of Science programs and other key stakeholders. This element of managing risk and opportunity together is increasingly challenging. Third, and this is one that I think a lot about, as I mentioned a moment ago, the people of the Oscar Facilities enterprise are making extraordinary impacts today, and their expertise and efforts are sought by many. But what I don't have here is that they're a finite resource. There's peril here in overpromising. There's peril here in perhaps the expectations of the community on the Oscar Facilities and what they can provide. The promise, though, is what I alluded to just a moment ago, is that the power of this expertise fused with others in the spirit of co-design that Oscar programs have long enshrined in our approaches is so powerful. And yet we know that many talented individuals do not participate in STEM pursuits, and that there's a broad strategic issue that this administration has made a frontline priority in doing everything we can to grow the talent base in our community. So our workforce challenges are significant. So the red piece is really a summative statement of, I think, from the perspective of our stakeholders, institutions, programs, and researchers are under pressure. They're going to be under increasing pressure to access these top flight tools. This is a strength of our system, the competition for ideas, but the competition for resources can be stark. And so providing or obtaining them on the user side is going to be increasingly challenging. And our users, our partners, our collaborators, we ourselves crave shared clarity of insight and intent. Where are you going? What will you build? What will you not build? What's going to be available in the next ALCC call in terms of what things I should start planning for? There's a whole scale, kind of Russian doll sort of cascade of these kinds of questions, large and small, proximal and distant. And so in green, and this is where I'm going to tee up a couple of slides of the vision I'd like to offer today for your consideration and your feedback going forward. Our challenge today is to confront this complexity and arrive at a strategy that maximizes the impact of OSCAR, the Office of Science and DOE investments to be greater than the sum of the parts. The vision.
And maybe
yes.
Go on. Ben had a question or comment about complexity, and I sort
Absolutely.
of one in the chat too. I mean, the diversity of opportunities is both the challenge and I think the opportunity and complexity. But Ben?
So actually, the thing I wanted to mention, I'm stealing from Margaret Martinosi, who is the SciES director at NSF, in a conversation on the subject of heterogeneity. We see all these different kinds of processors, the quantum things, the TPUs, the GPUs, and so on. If you look at what I imagine the classic high performance computing to be, it's historically taken advantage of the RISC instruction set architecture. Now what we're facing is much more diversity in the underlying hardware and its capabilities. That translates into some really tough challenges for compilers, for example, to get it right. To say nothing of operating systems that can figure out how to allocate these various more heterogeneous computing resources. So the challenge here extends upward in the stack, so to speak, in ways that we probably haven't thought about before. So I just want to reinforce the point that this is a really complicated time now, and the software guys have as much of a challenge ahead of them as the hardware guys ever had.
I really appreciate that comment, Vint, because it gives me a chance to pause and offer something important at this moment of, this is an all of OSCAR challenge. It's an all of community challenge. And I just want to make sure that throughout this presentation, you carry a sense that, although I'm speaking from the vision for the OSCAR facilities perspective, I believe in my bones that the quality of engagement and partnership between the three divisions in OSCAR and expressing out in the community of research, offering the community opportunities to jump into research that they see the facilities, for example, need desperately, right? That there's a path to contribute to tomorrow's operational paradigms that's visceral and real. That's some of the work that's next to, again, be more than the sum of our parts.
Vivek, your hand's up.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I mean, this has been a great discussion. I really appreciate the vision of being greater than the sum of the parts, but and look forward to more discussion when you're done too. But just following up on Vint's point, and this came up when we were working on the future HPC capabilities report that you also mentioned as one of the sources, is that it's not only complexity, but just stating the obvious here, it's a period of high uncertainty. So we need a strategy where we have to be prepared for uncertain and unknown outcomes, and which means taking a lot of risk. And actually, and that's a healthy approach rather than betting only on one approach. And just to follow up on Vince's comments about compilers, yeah, my colleagues in industry told me that, when the computing roadmap was pretty standardized, compilers just became a workhorse to generate binary code, but you could use things like libraries and all to deliver the capability. Now with this heterogeneity, the libraries just cannot keep up. So the compilers are needed more than a workhorse. They're really needed for innovation to manage this complexity. So great points, and look forward to more discussion.
Yes, and it's an opportunity for me to say, no, the green part is it. I don't have any other slides. No, I'm just kidding. Because how platitudinous is this last statement, right? It just says, let's go be great. That's of course just a little lip of the camel's nose here. And what I want to offer in the next few slides is to get in that uncomfortable space between the 30,000-foot view. This slide expresses was like, yeah, we know it, we see it, complexity, uncertainty, we're in it. And there's also some comfort to go down into the ground level. We kind of know what we're doing today, right? We know our user programs, we know where we're investing, and we have confidence in that. But the middle space of sort of what is the how, what is the approaches to building a strategy, that's really what I want to focus on in the next couple of slides. And before I get to that how, this is how I express for myself in the exercise of this really, rolling up my shirt sleeves and putting pen to paper for this moment with you in the community. And I'm thinking, of course, of the OSCAR team and the 4 facility directors out there in the audience. I'm looking forward to so many conversations following from this. But what does it mean to thrive in this era? What I envision is a complementary system of facilities, each independently thriving, each possessing agency to affect their missions. Right? That's sacrosanct. But collectively driving innovation in advanced scientific computing across DOE and beyond. And there's many flavors of that. It's expressing the richness of our stakeholder engagements, and the opportunity ahead of us. Again, this is the point I just alluded to, driving the state of the art with the OSCAR research and vendor communities. That we're only going to get there together. Catalyzing discovery and innovation in other communities. Responding to national needs. We have a very rich legacy in OSCAR of having the capacity and the ability to turn on a dime and provide resources, as you've heard this morning and we'll hear tomorrow. Delivering on our stakeholders' highest priorities with balance and equity. I'll talk more about this in a moment. Very challenging. Fostering scientific ecosystems. Again, more in a moment, but this is something that I see as essential to our strategies going forward, is to intentionally and visibly contribute to shaping formalized ecosystems that provide the scaffolding for the community to catch their own fish, so to speak, and to innovate on their own volition. Broadening the diversity of individual, institutional, and domain participation in our enterprise. And the last one, maybe the first one, I mean, demonstrating excellence in project management and operations is the ticket to the rest. If you screw that up, you're in a bad way, because you've lost they have huge opportunity costs, let's put it that way. If you screw up your fundamentals, you won't be able to do the elective, wonderful things you would do. And at the bottom here, a system in which we, and I say system little s, not big S, a system in which we, headquarters and facilities together, are managing enterprise risk and opportunity, and very importantly, facilitating our stakeholders' abilities to do so effectively. So our projection into the world moves beyond, I think, what it is today, and that a much more full-throated, I have more to offer about this in a moment, a much more full-throated stance in helping stakeholders who don't enjoy our native expertise contend with this uncertainty and this complexity. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes. This is a rubric, a visual rubric for the fundamental elements as I see them from my perch in OSCAR, of the OSCAR Facilities Enterprise core activities, and the feedback cycle on what I envision an annual cadence that informs our effectiveness. User programs, collaborations for priority DOE and national needs, and ecosystems. These are sort of the outward facing delivery of services, of resources, of impact to the wider community. But then something which I've called shared salience, again, I'm going to explain all this in a moment, that is something cyclical, in which we're in a space together with our stakeholders, that I think is essential to countervailing this complexity. And that shared salience is really the marker of this cycle of understanding our impacts and forming investments. That is, of course, the lifeblood of any enterprise, right? But the fundamental point I'm going to make in a moment is that the pace of the complexity and uncertainty demands a new response, a new up-tempo response for ourselves and for our stakeholders. And just like doing this slide, a little meta, it's about engaging and surfacing issues in a visible way, listening and reflecting, then addressing, taking decisions, implementing, and repeating the cycle. So let me step through a bit methodically here each of these four concepts. I believe that we do a lot of things today, some of which are more brightly and vividly expressed than others. And let me talk specifically about our user programs and our collaborations. So I'm going to go sort of from top to bottom, left to right. So across the top row, user programs. This is fantastic right now. I mean, we have a legacy of, and what has been architected over years is incredibly strong. So there's a takeaway message here is that I think our user programs are an incredibly firm footing, and there's always more we can do here with more resources. So we have a visible portfolio, we have Insight, we have ALCC, we have ERCAP, we have Director's Discretionary, we have the ability to respond to national needs. And actually with ESNet, in the past 2 years, we've worked very hard to create a similarly visible framework for how the site user community understands their relationship with ESNet. And so, and that, actually, can you see my cursor if I do this? Wonderful, okay. This is solid. And I think here in the future state, the fundamental is continue to broaden the user base and satisfy both our native mission drivers to expand our impact with our workforce goals strategically as a nation, as DOE, as the Office of Science and OSCAR, And I want to say too, though, that that's not the scalability of extending to new users I don't know if it's linear, but it might be sort of quasi-linear. It's a hand-to-hand thing with whether it's a new industrial user, a new institution you've never worked with. So that's a pregnant question here. And what are the resources involved? And I want to say this out there for you. Hey, Sudeep, Gina, Mike, Inder, if you're out there, one of the things I thought a lot about in this talk is you, but also that you don't hear, oh my gosh, what has Ben promising that we'll do? Because at the end of the day, about aligning with stakeholders is about understanding the resources and the people, the people resources we need to do the things we're choosing to do. So let me actually segue to the second row here. And I think that last point I made is something that's been on my mind a lot this year. For the collaborations for priority DOE and national needs activities, I call it, there's a lot of activity that we do today that is a bit subliminal, actually, or it might not be called out as brightly and vividly to the community as our user programs, which are so visible and so standing in relief. People are competing for the user time, right? They see that, they see the allocation programs, or they know they need to connect to ESNet or need more bandwidth. If you're a DOE program and want to collaborate, we have a very rich legacy of doing that, but it's typically embedded in the core operations and under the covers of our user programs. And this poses a real social challenge for the special people I just mentioned and their teams of like, well, how many new things is DOE going to ask me to do this year? Like how far can we really extend ourselves? We always have a spirit of doing what needs to be done. And I think the labs are incredible and the 4 facilities are incredible in delivering on that. But I think we would do well by ourselves in a future state to define this portfolio more vividly and to consider even new models. And this is an open invitation for dialogue in the spirit of a straw man of if we are going to contemplate that, making this more vivid and visible so that we can communicate to stakeholders the things that we're definitely doing and maybe definitely not doing till maybe next time, that we have models expressed for what these activities look like, maybe campaigns, maybe multi-year efforts that have a wrapper around them that are very visible and that really inspire people to join in those efforts. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to go deeper on the ecosystems and shared salience pieces, because those are the pieces that are not actually represented in the portfolio today. The ecosystems are incipient. They're not yet defined. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. I think the opportunity here is to define them and make them visible, and to foster stewardship and governance models that provide the foundations for community innovation. And again, that inspire participation, and critically in the ECP transition report from ASCAC really brings this to the foreground, to sustain careers. This is an enormous issue in this band where we know that, especially in scientific software, there are folks who are kind of living soft money to soft money opportunity, who are doing heroic things for the community. And that it's sometimes a shockingly few number of people who are, curating something that many depend on, bringing that above the line so that I have a slide when I talk to the ESNet requirements for you kickoff of an iceberg, right? Some people see that top of the iceberg, there's a whole, 90% of it's below the surface. That's the spirit of the ecosystems idea. And then shared salience, I'll get into this in a moment. We have a portfolio today of really effective requirements gathering processes. Some of them are ritualized and formalized in the best sense. Others aggregate insight within the teams at the facilities, but they're generally separate. And the coordination across them is tacit. I've been pushing on that from a variety of ways. And the synthesis, kind of aggregating the insight across them, is post facto. So I see the opportunity here, and I'll get more to this in a moment, to make this more visible, to make it feeling more annual, because we have to contend with the pace and with the world in which we live is changing, and to capture, structure, and aggregate insight as we go from a variety of sources, even maybe crowdsourcing, new inventive ways of sort of aggregating with the insight that we know exists in the living body politic of the OSCAR enterprise. So a quick note on these ecosystems. What do I mean by that? One in particular, and you saw a slide of this ilk from Barb and her presentation in July, that we have this incipient ecosystem of complex workflows that span multiple Office of Science user facilities. And this is something that colleagues in OSCAR on the research and partnership side have invested in over years to kind of bite off pieces of this puzzle of middleware workflows. But it really is an all-encompassing, sort of dizzying prospect to contend with what does this mean? And in the center of this diagram, you see the potential power of this is to say, look, here are these resources, here are these new tools, here are advanced algorithms, here are things like advanced wireless test beds or special compute assets, test beds, and all the OSCAR resources stitched together by ESNet. What is in that cloudy thing? What is that? If this is going to be its best expression of itself in offering a range of researchers the opportunity to compose workflows that span this infrastructure, a whole host of them want to have nothing to do with the complexity. They just want a turnkey thing. Others will want to have their hands in it and kind of work closely on the workflow. What are the managed services that would make this sustainable? These are the kind of questions that we're contending with. And for the past year and a half, I've had the privilege with the OSCAR facility directors of standing up the a task force on what we call the Integrated Research Infrastructure Task Force, represented by several folks across the 4 OSCAR facilities, to take this leap. And this is sort of a blend of the shared salience and the ecosystem ideas of what will it take to, let's put it this way, what are the operational implications of different paradigms of integration, either between the HPC facilities and the ESNet or with the experimental observational facilities. And there's a white paper that they released earlier this year. And the diagram on the right illustrates, in one sense, the complexity from a systems standpoint. What you have today here is that any given experimental facility has to approach our assets separately. And there's a potential in the tomorrow for that experience to be a more seamless one. It's represented by number 2, and then to extend that to multiple experimental facilities where they all have a sort of gateway into the compute and data infrastructure. The shared salience piece of this activity for the past year and a half, hard-won effort, the task force, I really challenged them to, what are the just few categories, concepts that inform a stable delivery of services, right? And so they came up with this rubric, which I think illustrates the power of this kind of thinking, of this synthesis and really resolving into what are the concepts that inform potential scale of effort to go from today to tomorrow. So allocations, accounts, data, applications, scheduling, workflows, publications, archiving. If you look at the white paper, these are clearly explicated, but the point here is more of the meta point that these kinds of activities, cross-cutting and synthesizing the insight across the OSCAR facilities enterprise, is a necessary step to contending with the possible investments that might uplift the whole ocean, all the ships in the ocean. I've already touched on scientific software. ECP has an enormous impact on us in terms of the social lessons learned, the power of the partnerships architected through the ECP project, and what the ASCAC report, Transitioning OSCAR After ECP, illustrates is the yearning for the extension of the ECP ecosystem now into a broader sense. And I think that's really what we're in the middle of right now. We have this task force inside OSCAR that I left the chance to participate in, and really having really rich conversations with many in the community, and looking forward to that RFI. And there's a recent white paper here, The Importance of Stewardship and Sustainability of Research Software in the Office of Science, written by, again, folks spanning the OSCAR facilities and the research divisions at the 3, at Argonne, Berkeley, and Oak Ridge, that expressed, I think, this yearning by a number in the community to really go there and take that next step to architect and bring above the waterline the ecosystem. I see these things as hand in hand. I see that especially for the ecosystems or for the other models I've articulated, that those core activities and their adaptation on an annual cadence to what we hear from stakeholders about their needs and what the investment opportunities that might present in the federal budget context, for example, necessitate that shared synthesis. And so it was just a happy coincidence that my first month and a half after joining OSCAR in January 2017, I remember going down to Arlington, Virginia for the Exascale Crosscut review. And this report has had an outsized impact on my ability to absorb the complexity of the OSCAR enterprise. But to me, it is the cardinal example of the power of synthesis. So that workshop did an immediate look back while it was fresh of the preceding very methodical, extensive program by Office of Science program requirements reviews that have been conducted. I think the shocking thing, sort of, when you take a step back and look at the crosscut report, is that it purports to be, right, the topic is exascale, HPC, right? Well, in fact, thematically and in substance, it puts its hands on grand challenge level issues that extend across the entire research enterprise, including data intensive workflows, AI, ML, networking, and more. It was just an incredibly powerful report that we used as the basis actually for the Integrated Research Infrastructure Task Force as our starting place. So now turning back to the theme I mentioned at the top about the Office of Science user facilities. It's very vivid in my mind how unique this community is, and the work that I alluded to 8 years ago to articulate the core principles that guide our operations and oversight. What I didn't anticipate that might be just a little bit of a nudge towards is the fomenting of a sense of community. And last year, Chris Fall, the former director of the Office of Science, and Dr. Binkley and Dr. Kung asked several of us in the Office of Science and in the community to, on a pretty quick step, while it was still fresh, again, here's that notion, still fresh, still vivid, get around the hearth together and reflect on the impact of the COVID era. So this transacted in a very short amount of time between October to December, where we did some planning and initial engagements and then had a 3-event kind of asynchronous model event of bringing the Office of Science user facilities together. And I encourage you to take a look at this report. It's the richest expression I've seen of what the social practice and the lived experience is of the people who make large-scale research infrastructure tick. And even though it's about the look back at the COVID era, we infused it with a spirit of, we wanted to use this as an opportunity, not just convene on that crisis, but visions for the future. There's a whole chapter on data and computing infrastructure, but specifically, I call out this quote that the facility directors expressed an interest in hearing about the other facilities, challenges, and strategies, and really got a lot out of that. And so in December, we're going to have a follow-up. Dr. Kung's office has convened a short follow-up meeting, and I think data and compute topics will be central to that. But the point here is that we're building a community of practice through shared insight. And so rounding the bend here with the last couple phases of this presentation, I want to come back to the rubric. To me, this idea of shared salience is about being in a space with each other and with our stakeholders in which we are able to manage risk and opportunity together with an extensible and systematized methodology, underscore lightweight. No one can contend, hey, life is complex too. No one's going to tolerate something that's very heavy and burdensome, right? The art form here will be to do something in which we curate insight that's an offering, engaging with the community, surfacing that insight, offering it together, and allowing the space for us to listen to each other, reflect, and then make those decisions to address and implement on the federal side and with the OSCAR facilities, and to repeat that on a cadence so that when new entrants come up, new priorities surface, a new administration, a new discovery totally turns a field on its head, that we have the ability to absorb that and ask these questions of ourselves and our communities. Do we understand each other's priorities? Do we understand the known knowns and the known unknowns, to be Rumsfeldian? And really central in what I'm personally really inspired by, and the work that I see in the scientific software ecosystem, incipient ecosystem, and in ECP, and in our work on integrated research infrastructure, is do we see patterns in this insight that stand in relief to inform our investments? This is the key. If we have the salience in the insight that emerges to see, I see this workflow, this priority workflow for the Office of Nuclear Physics at the Facility for Rare Isotope Beams is fairly similar in the design pattern to the needs of several of the X-ray light sources. And oh, by the way, this fusion energy sciences user facility workflow over here. That's the kind of insight that can really accelerate the decision-making process to go to that place. So this is the last short message of this talk, as I'm looking forward to time for discussion. I hope if nothing else, you absorbed a sense that the people of the Oscar Facilities Division and in headquarters and in the Oscar facilities are truly passionate about their engagement with the community. And it's really the engine that drives us forward. But I wanted to end with a sort of historical perspective. And as a humble armchair student of DOE history, I would argue that the arc of DOE history bends towards ecosystems. And you know the story well. DOE and its predecessor agency, the Atomic Energy Commission, its antecedent was the Manhattan Project, born in a moment of global crisis with breathtaking speed, executed and fused in this amalgam that I give multiple presentations at the DOE Project Leadership Institute each year, and one of them I talk about the role of the project owner and emphasize how we are this fusion of two cultures, the military and the academic, and that cultural DNA means this culture of project management. There you have General Leslie Groves, fresh off building the Pentagon building under budget, charged with this activity, and he picks a young theoretical physicist, J. Robert Oppenheimer, to be the head of the science enterprise. And there it is on the other hand, the culture of open inquiry. And every day we feel that dialectic tension in its best sense. DOE Era Zero, Manhattan Project sites. What we know today basically becomes to zeroth order the footprint of the DOE National Laboratory System. In DOE's first era, the dawn of the Atomic Energy Commission and really a full-throated federal expression of investment in not only scientific research, but research infrastructure. We have the birth of the National Laboratory System exemplified by E.O. Lawrence in Berkeley Lab, getting permission up on the Hill to get the building built for the 184-inch cyclotron, build a bigger mousetrap. But we know that too is about the birth of big science, team science. Lawrence brings together, he knows he needs a huge team of not just talented scientists, but engineers, technicians, machinists, electricians. He needs the best, he needs them to work well together. But this infrastructure in the early days of the AEC, to broad brushstrokes, is essentially built for intramural use, right? This is the government investing for government R&D. Through many, many, many hours of conversation, especially with my former boss, Pat Damer, and others over the years, and trying to understand what is the research infrastructure that we steer, these scientific user facilities. I posit that the second era of the DOE National Labs is evolving to become a more open campuses, a more open stance in terms of the availability of resources to the open scientific community, a long evolution over decades in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s to what we have today, which you can't take for granted. How amazing is it that these Office of Science user facilities are open access, free for non-proprietary use? The expression that openness is the best way for us to advance our mission is now enshrined and sort of in the vasculature of the DOE National Laboratory System, and I believe has made a huge impact on the very nature of the lab system itself. And so what I posit in the next era of DOE is the natural evolution to that further step of an open innovation ecosystem of research platforms connected together. And we already see this again, I'm overusing this word incipient, but it's happening. What ECP provides us is a model for both the matrixing of world expertise across the lab system in a formalized activity. What we saw last year with COVID and the stand up overnight of the National Virtual Biotechnology Laboratory expresses this idea of a composed ecosystem of assets, giving the world a front door to a rich set of tools. And lastly, the picture postcard of our quest perhaps to contend with the possibilities of the ecosystem of the Office of Science user facilities. So with that, I want to end with a note of, I believe the Oscar Facilities Enterprise, in partnership with the research community, with our key partners in the vendor community, has the opportunity to be the essential engine of insight, innovation, and impact to bring that next era forward for DOE. And it's all about the people at the Oscar facilities. And let's see how far we can go together. It's been a privilege to offer these thoughts to you, and it's in the spirit of truly humility. I'm looking forward to your comments today, but going forward over weeks and months. Thank you so much for the privilege of listening to my presentation.
Thanks, Ben. We appreciate those thoughts. Beth, you have your hand up.
As always, I can't resist an empty microphone. First of all, thanks to Ben for a terrific presentation, very comprehensive, gives us a kind of a global sense of what you have in mind. I like the ecosystem metaphor because I think that accurately captures both the unity and the complexity of the environment that we're operating in. The only thing that caught my attention is that when you brought up the Manhattan Project as a successful program, all I could think of was the irony of this, because success is it blew up.
I talk about this in my presentations. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, we might want to give some thought to whether we're using this metaphor. It says, how did your experiment go? Well, it blew up. Well, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, on that moment of levity, I did a slide that ended up on the cutting room floor, and not to be too flip, but if you're familiar with the classic Charlie Chaplin film Modern Times, in which his character contends with modernity in a very visceral way by being sucked into the gears of his factory's machine. The movie poster for that, which is available on Wiki, is of poor Chaplin standing above two giant electrical switches about to pull them, which to me is about, there are people out there, I think, who are contending with this uncertainty and complexity of the same sort of, oh gosh, like, I have to make a choice, they might say. Do I go into this computing environment and surrender control over my code or my fate? What is that risk proposition for them, an individual researcher? That is also at the heart of these ideas, I hope that I expressed, that at all scales, whether it's the individual PI, at an institutional level, or at a user facility, I think we can make a really credible and impactful offering through that notion of shared salience.
I can't resist. You know, back in the day, in my early career, I was writing software and using assembly language. And I can just imagine the guys who were accustomed to that saying, what, you want me to give up control of my program to a compiler? Are you out of your mind? So yes, a lot of people have to struggle with that. On the other hand, man, life got a lot easier when things got more automatic. So maybe we can look forward to that.
All right, Vivek and then Roscoe.
Okay. Yeah, thanks again, Ben. So I just want to continue that thread about not just complexity, but we're entering a period of high uncertainty. And for nostalgia's sake, some of us will remember the uncertainty when we were coming out of Vector. Before we went to MPP, there were companies like Thinking Machine, Kendall Square Research, Inmos Transputer, and so on. So there was a period of exploration. And it felt like a high anxiety period because uncertainty is anxiety. But I think the point that also came out in our study that we did a couple of years ago is that we have to be prepared to innovate and explore because we know that there's going to be uncertainty. So with those general comments coming to facilities, you know, when you explore in this period of uncertainty, what often happens is research groups put together their own test beds and, you know, try to get results for them. And it may be exciting for the first couple of months or so, but 6 months down the road, they realize they really aren't equipped even to, you know, manage a test bed in a way that it can be used for research. At the same time, you know, your 28 user facilities are extremely large scale. So what I'm wondering about is it seems there's an opportunity for facilities to help in this upcoming era of uncertainty by standing up test beds with full expectation that this is small scale, the level of service is not going to be the same as a scientific user facility, but at the same time, your team has skills that research groups don't have. And you know what researchers would like to do is just basically use a Jupyter notebook and access all these capabilities and leave it to ideally teams like the facilities to provide the services even when they're exploring test beds. So just want to hear your thoughts about this tension and the opportunity.
I think it's a wonderful comment because my mind goes in multiple directions of the potential to offer insight of in a skinny and hopefully appealing way for how to do certain things. But I also think immediately of, you know, communications 101. It matters where that message is coming from. And I think that if it comes within the community, more than from, or at least from multiple vectors, that is also important to contemplate. So I think one of the challenges is we have today, how do people see us? I mean, I would venture that many folks just think of the user programs and think of that's the interface. And I think what your comment represents is another theme I've borne witness to with my colleagues in the Scientific Sustainability Task Force in OSCAR, and reading the report and talking to many in the community of the power of a very visible, sort of centralized, I don't want to make too much of the centralization, but a centralized resource for design patterns that you can go and activate yourself with, and that you have a sense again of that. What's the risk reward choice? How much time is this really going to take? What resources do I need to have in place on my campus? And from my experience with the ESNet team, the end-to-end issue is so challenging when you're talking about a workflow that extends beyond the four walls of your laboratory. Even for your campus network LAN folks to contend with, why isn't this data thing that they want to do working? So I think there's been investments over the years that give us a quick thrust if we want to go there for a more kind of organized and full-throated approach to providing informational and insight resources like that. But I don't think it's manifest other than in pockets today.
Right, and that actually just leads to a brief comment about the interface, because I really see a big value in facilities in terms of the expertise of the team, as you called out, right? It's people. And then as we are in this period of complexity and uncertainty, facilities team members would be in a great position to advise scientists about which kinds of test beds or future directions are most suitable for which science domains than others. And so there's that, it's not just a transactional, here's a service, it's actually an opportunity to provide guidance as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Roscoe?
Oh, you're muted, Roscoe.
I sure am. I'm muted. That's unusual. Yeah, so some of this discussion really touched on points I wanted to get to as well, particularly thinking about how the ecosystem interfaces with with universities, which I think we were just talking about. And also, one of the things we brought out in the transition report was the importance, and I think it is reflected in this whole discussion, of having technical expertise along the management chain at all levels, not just at a few levels or a top-down only kind of way. But that then also raises the question of if one moves into DOE phase 3 or 4 in the way you're talking about, how does that change the role of things like ASCAC and the advisory committees?
Oh, that's an unfair question. It makes you more powerful. You know, I know I'm going out there with that supposition of a phase 3, and I'm not naive enough to think about the institutional forces and the inertia, and actually the power of what truly the national laboratory system. We know it fundamentally. One of the things that it gives the government is competition of ideas, right? And that's sometimes pretty naked, and sometimes that collaboration can get friction can emerge, because at the end of the day, people are competing in the marketplace to assert what they think might be the better way to go. So that's, I think the offering I have, and I hope I'm not dodging the question, is that as I hope it doesn't sound cheesy or cloying, but the spirit in which these activities are undertaken and the opportunity for people to assert their views and feel listened to is fundamental to the quality of the outcome. And so if we're contemplating, for example, standing up some element that means that even at the level of a user facility, you're surrendering some autonomy to go into something that's systematized, then it can't just be a decision that's taken one time and you walk away. It's fundamental to the stewardship and governance of that thing that you create a space for all the stakeholders to be together on a regular basis to contend with, not just the day-to-day, oh, this broke, but the strategy, where is this going? And that maybe I did wanted to wait back to your point, is that if this is all visible, that means that the community and expressed in our federal advisory committees can see it and can provide essential insight and commentary and recommendations to its evolution.
Mm-hmm. Good, that helps. I know we also have had in the past, and certainly continuing, sort of direct collaborations among the Office of Science advisory committees around collaborative projects between the offices. And, you know, in writing the transition report for OSCAR, we interviewed, you know, the ADs of all the other parts of the Office of Science. So I think, you know, if there's a commonality of vision at this level of breadth, it probably requires some systematic response at the level of these sort of interfaces. And at the other extreme, at the university level, I think, I mean, my experience at my university are that they're sort of different categories of people. There are people who feel themselves engaged with the labs and people who are sort of circling around on the outside and not knowing how to get started with that. And that probably would change in some ways as well.
Well, and on that note, I mean, it's not an accident that Bill Miller has joined us, and I think he's, you know, poor Bill, we've mentioned his name multiple times, but we want to be building those relationships with our other agency closest partners in that spirit too. I think that what the close of 2020, the issuance of the NSTC Future Advanced Computing Ecosystem report, and the lived experience of the people across the agency leadership who contributed to that discussion. Dr. Binkley was a co-chair. What you've surfaced in this moment with the role of our federal advisory committees, that puts me right back in my days working in the Office of the Deputy Director for Science Programs, about how challenging it is for such a wide, you know, the spectrum of our activities is so vast, to maintain bare cognizance of where each of these major programs is going, what forces, you know, I haven't even touched on in this moment today about our stewardship of 10 of the 17 DOE national laboratories is a frontline mission of the Office of Science. So the health of those 10 labs sits in equal standing with our delivery of research and grant making and investments directly, and with major research infrastructure. So I hear your message and resonate with it, Roscoe, that it sort of would take all voices, the opportunity for all to be heard, and the challenge is synthesizing that without it being burdensome.
Okay, good, thank you.
Karen?
Thanks. First, I just want to say that thank you for that really, you know, inspiring presentation, and I feel kind of fortunate to have you as at the helm. So I just wanted to thank you on that, and I just want to circle back to a comment that Vivek made on the test beds, and you know, it really resonates. You know, the large scale facilities have, you know, excellent modalities for interfacing to, you know, very large scale number of users and so forth. But there is, I think, you know, a growing need of, you know, test beds that take advantage of some of these, you know, heterogeneous and emerging technologies. One, maybe even quantum and other complementary technologies. And there really isn't, you know, other than sort of the four walls of your own laboratory, there really isn't at a larger scale, let's call it intermediate scale, way of, you know, really pushing forward research and science at, you know, more at the technology level that interfaces with some of those systems. So I don't really have solutions. I think this is a difficult, you know, how do you do this and so forth. But I just wanted to bring it up and just say that I think it's really worthwhile to think about how to implement such a thing, you know, going forward. I think it would benefit quite a large number of research.
Thank you, Karen. I see Barb nodding, and it reminds me again of the the opportunity we have with the Advanced Computing Technologies division and the investments that we dream of, where there's a natural complementarity that we can see with our mainline user programs in the facilities enterprise, interleaving with test beds of the future and the conversations going on in the living moment across our 3 labs and within NSA partners about what are the best models for renewing our vendor engagements in this new era. I think there's a really strong appetite to engage, and we have our, of course, I haven't mentioned, I'm remiss in not mentioning SBIR, STTR. And I, speaking with you, Karen. So we see very vividly the portfolio needs to also speak to coherence of strategy and invitation with multiple doors to come in, and not just through that specific channel, but now you've come into a broader enterprise where you can see what's going on here in a way that you maybe didn't if you were standing out. And so it's a very high level response, but I just want to underscore that we think the same ways within the halls of OSCAR.
So I'm gonna for a moment channel my inner John Shelf here. So John may want to pay attention and see if I've been infected by a ghost. But one of the things I sometimes, and it's related to Karen's question about test beds and Vivek's as well. You know, the great thing about ECP was it brought the community together. In some ways, that's also a challenge because despite the heterogeneity to some extent of the hardware ecosystems, they're pretty homogeneous compared to, I think, the world that you described and that we see could be coming. So, and it's hard if you're on the hook to deploy production infrastructure to take crazy risks, right? That sort of wars against that ethos. But you know, having co-chaired the BRN group on integrated co-design from silicon, may be the wrong thing to even think about, you know, custom hardware from and software up and down the entire ecosystem stack. You know, how do we build some of those, knowing that most of them are going to fail? That's the definition, but you're going to learn some really interesting things. And maybe another way to say it is if you talk to a vendor and you think you might be able to buy it from them in 3 to 5 years, it's probably too near term. Not for everything, but for some of those crazy ideas. So how do we expand the space with a continuum of risks to look at some crazier things that are a complement to maybe the evolutionary process?
Yeah, my mind tends to, I hope it doesn't sound platitudinous or repetitive, that one of the strengths of the US federal R&D enterprise is that we are manifold. So whether it's DARPA, whether it's the DoD research labs, whether it's NSF in academia or us, we have to maintain cognizance of who's trying what. And I think the strength of the US system is that there's a variety of models applied to the innovation chain that give us a leg up competitively as a country. I think for OSCAR specifically, the opportunity to work with the vendors in a variety of ways. So one of the things we're attendant to is it's very difficult if the only game in town is compete for the giant system contract once every N years. And oops, well, if you didn't win that one, see you in another N years. I see Barb's hand up. Would you like to interject, Barb?
No, go ahead. Finish your thought.
I think that was about it. I mean, that there's got to be intentionality here. There has to be. I mean, the labs really provide the front door to working with the vendors, right? We at headquarters have a bit more arm's length because again, it is the people deploying the systems on the ground are the ones who have to keep their ear to the ground and maintain those relationships. So that speaks again to the complexity of the human interactions in sculpting strategy and understanding, do we have the portfolio we need to have that balances risk and opportunity?
Barb, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to go back and just say, you know, I even go further out than say Ben. I think it goes back to the experience that we had with the microelectronics workshop. What we have to be cognizant of is pay attention to what's happening in basic energy sciences. What are the new materials? What's coming out of the nano centers? And I think we have to have a stronger partnership with BES, because I think this is where the next generation of computers is going to come. Certainly, you know, what the Office of Science is doing across the Office of Science and basic course for quantum. So I think all of this has to inform what Oscar is doing, and I think that's consistent with what Ben is thinking as well.
Other questions or comments? I don't know if, John, if I channeled you appropriately with that question.
Yeah, no, I thought it was great. I put something in chat, which was really, I really liked your diagram for the continuous optimization of Oscar's program, and I was kind of interested in what's the are there complementary roles and responsibilities that facilities, ACT, and research can contribute to that diagram? We can't be some kind of amorphous blob contributing to that. And this goes back to what Dan was saying. How can we establish some complementary capabilities that have different balances of risk and reward?
I think I have to turn that around and just turn that question mark into a period. It's like, yes, we need to do that. And it would be inappropriate for me to suppose that in this moment of offering just this bare concept that I've got that all figured out. No, I mean, this is the work. This is the work within the halls of Oscar. This is the work with ASCAC. This is the work with the facilities and at the labs and with the community. So no, I can't agree more. That's the challenge ahead of us, is that everybody sees themselves, their sort of Venn diagram overlap with each other. You know, like, what are our interfaces? Even in your portfolio, I've had this thought in, you know, of actually for the team that's gelling in the facilities division that I'm privileged to lead, is let's take a step back for an afternoon and talk about, and then let's get with our you know, our interfaces with each other and where the rubs are, and let's talk with our with Jaren's team and with Barb's team and ACT. It's this, at the end of the day, it's kind of shockingly small numbers of people who have to kind of be in that interstitial space between ground level and macro strategy. And that is honestly what makes being in the Office of Science awesome. If anyone's out there, it's just a fantastic place, because you're in it every day in a small team that's trying to, if you like strategy, if you like trying to fuse the where's the world going to the real world, that's what we do.
Vivek, you had another comment?
Yeah, just a comment to add on to what you said, Dan. And you know, basic tenet of science is that we fail often. And in tech companies, there's the mantra of fail fast so that you can succeed. So I think there's got, especially when that exploration phase, getting back to the test bed example, we should envision in a few years an ASCAC meeting where the highlight is someone stood up a test bed, learned a few lessons, learned that it worked well for some domains, and it just did not work as you might have thought in other domains. And that's actually a success in exploration, not a failure. So I think some of that mindset, success should not be tied to the success of the test bed. It's, you try it out for a limited period, learn from it, and move on.
Thanks for that. Are there other questions, comments, or observations? Well, Ben, thanks for a thoughtful and stimulating presentation. And I'm looking at, we're at basically at the bottom of the hour. I'm going to suggest that maybe we take a 15-minute break. It'll give some people maybe a chance for bio opportunities, as well as, depending on where you are, what time zone, grab some food. And let's reconvene at 15 to the hour. All right, let's see if we have a critical mass of people back with us. Andrew, let's give it one more minute and then we'll jump in.
Sounds good. I guess it's a good time to verify that you can see my slides, Dan.
Yes, we can.
Great, thanks.
Well, all right. I think whenever you want to start, Andrew.
Okay, thanks a lot. Appreciate the invitation. I'm going to do something a little bit different today. Maybe this follows along the lines a little bit of the last discussion, but I feel like we tend to want to say all of the great things we've done, and sometimes we make it look a little too easy. So this talk, I'm going to do something that I don't usually do, but I'm going to focus a little bit more on the challenges that we faced, and some of it will be how we have overcome them, and in some cases we're still in the process of overcoming them. But I hope to give a little bit more of a flavor of how difficult this project is and what distinguishes it maybe from the early science program of a facilities procurement project. Okay, so a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'll give just a little background to make sure we're all on the same page, and I'll say where we are in terms of project metrics for the application development project. But then I want to sort of turn into the main focus of the talk, which is what is it that we're doing that is so difficult? And what are the unique challenges to the application development portion of this particular project? And I'm going to do this by looking in a little bit of depth at 4 case studies, which are in a lot of ways, many of them at least, not standard HPC applications. So I want to look at the metagenomics project. I want to look at reconstructing images from diffraction patterns at light sources. I look at codes for the design and analysis of small modular nuclear reactors, and then modeling the power grid, in particular, complex failure scenarios in the power grid. Then I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges in the sort of hardening of the software ecosystem, particularly around new hardware and the difficulties that is posed for us in the project. Then I'll give some observations and a pointer to our annual report. All right, so just really taking it from the top, for people who aren't familiar with this, I'll just make a couple of high-level comments about ECP. It's a 7-year project, and that's important because in these application domains, a lot happens in 7 years that is independent of the hardware that the teams are running on, just algorithmic and modeling innovations. Okay, so it started back in 2016, and it'll be wrapping up in 2023. There are 6 core DOE labs, but just in the application development portion, which I'm going to be talking about, there are 14 labs participating, 48 universities and 12 companies. So it's just expertise from diverse organizations, people with different backgrounds, specializations. And I'll also remind you that there are 3 technical focus areas. I'm talking about the bold-faced one, application development, our interactions with the people who develop enabling computational technologies, the people who are in charge of being the liaison between the facilities and ECP are incredibly important. And we would not have nearly the success we've had so far if it weren't for those collaborations. But I'm going to be talking from the application development perspective because that's what I'm tasked with. And a couple other things. Okay, so we have 81 research teams, and the teams you can imagine are sort of 7 to 10 people, different fractions of them. And the application projects I'll talk about, we always think of sort of stakeholder DOE program offices. So these cover 9 different DOE program offices and then the NIH. And I say that because maintaining a close relationship with them, briefing them once or twice a year, and getting their input on what we're doing and future directions has been a very important part of this process. All right, so I just want to talk about what I see as the 4 key ingredients to an application development project in ECP. And they interplay in very complex ways, and that I'll try to explain throughout the talk. But everyone starts with sort of a scientific or engineering goal. So we asked everyone when the project started to imagine if you had 50 or 100 or whatever times the computing power, what frontiers could you push in your application domain, whether it was more science or engineering oriented. And there's sort of a proxy for that, which we call the challenge problem. The challenge problem does not represent the totality of what people will have accomplished, but it demonstrates the new capabilities for all of the things they want to be able to do with the codes they develop in ECP. Then there's sort of this other piece, which is just pure algorithmic innovation. Okay, in the time scale of 7 years, people are going to think of new ways to do algorithms that were based off of heuristics. So there might be better heuristics, better approximations that could be made, entirely new ways of approaching problems. And this, in a lot of cases, might have nothing to do with the hardware at all. It might just be in terms of raw operation counts. So I think it's really important that we're not just focused on benchmarking what was done last generation and the next generation. And then there's the piece that is the porting to the new hardware. Okay, so even if you were doing exactly the same thing, we all know that the systems are different enough where achieving speed up on these systems is often not trivial. And a lot of examples tend to focus on success stories, but I want to try to show cases where we have motifs which are not sort of traditional GPU motifs, and where it requires a lot of work and innovation to be able to take advantage of the systems. And then what I think of as a fourth critical component is integration with people developing enabling computational technologies. Okay, so in the project, we obviously do not force, but we try to foment and encourage collaboration. So the use of solver libraries or profiling tools, whatever the case might be, and up to the co-design of application-specific libraries. So it's very hard to sort of be a lone wolf in this field. There are so many moving parts and it's so complex. And, you know, to make people aware of what is being developed and have them leverage those things when it makes sense is, I think, one of the critical successes of the project, but it's come with a lot of effort. So anyhow, the interplay between these different pieces is really complex, and I'll try to give a flavor of that and sort of what that means for making progress in the project. I was reading the new version of Hennessy and Patterson, and I just saw a quote that was exactly articulated what I was trying to say. So I thought I would mention it here, which is sort of the emphasis on benchmarks and what that means for sort of a holistic view of innovation in computational science. So they say the downside of benchmarks is that innovation is chiefly limited to the architecture and compiler. Better data structures, algorithms, programming language cannot be used, since that would give a misleading result. The system could win because of, say, the algorithm and not because of the hardware or the compiler. While these guidelines are understandable when the foundations of computing are relatively stable, as they were in the late 90s to the first half of this decade, they're undesirable during a programming revolution. For this revolution to succeed, we need to encourage innovation at all levels. So that's really a guiding principle. And of course, it complicates quantitative analysis of our project metrics like KPPs, because the comparisons become a little unclear. And we worked very hard to add rigor to that. And I think we were successful ultimately, but it's important to keep in mind that many things are happening at many levels. And, you know, we're not just sort of porting code. And I say that people here probably know that, but I think outside of the computational field, there are misunderstandings. So let me just sort of take you back to the beginning. We wanted a representative portfolio of applications to kind of lead the charge into the exascale era. Obviously, you can bin these many different ways, but there are exciting scientific computing going on in many different areas of the DOE. And I'm glad that Doug did this and not me, but, you know, working with DOE obviously very closely, eventually 24 application projects were chosen. It's a little more complicated than that. 6 of them were so-called seed projects, which got a little bit of startup funding, and 5 of the 6 of those ended up becoming full application projects. And then we have these co-design projects, which are really computational motifs that are kind of designed in tandem with the applications, because they're very customized to what the application is doing. But this includes about 78 separate codes, because a lot of the projects have multiple codes that they're coupling. You know, probably tens of millions of lines of code. A lot of the codes have, by our standards, very large user communities, like computational chemistry, for example. Others could have still hundreds of research teams using them. And I point that out because it's very hard to do these disruptive changes and sustain the ongoing science that the user community requires. Obviously, we wanted a representative sample of critical science and engineering domains. And these were mostly just MPI codes or MPI with OpenMP or pthreads on multi-core nodes at the start of the project. Okay, and so I think everybody knows about the procurements, but I'll just point out that, you know, we've moved from most systems being multi-core CPU, you know, clusters of multi-core CPUs, except for Titan, of course, had a single GPU per node early, but we moved through this sort of phase of NVIDIA GPUs to now we're going on these exascale systems to a diverse ecosystem of multi-GPU architectures. And that's been really important for this project. in ways that I'll hopefully describe shortly. But we're targeting in particular Frontier and Aurora for this project, but the NVIDIA machine perlmutter is something that we've had, and for the larger purposes beyond ECP, we're obviously interested in doing science on any platform that we can get. So portability has become very important. So we've moved from no GPUs to all NVIDIA GPUs to a diverse ecosystem of multi-GPU architectures. And the migration for every single one of the teams in this project has kind of looked like CPU and single GPU optimized, CPU to multi-GPU systems. And a lot of that was trying to get good performance on Summit, which I'll talk about in a minute, or Sierra, which is a similar system. And in some cases, people trying to morph the AI-focused hardware for their particular problem with some little success and some failure. To diverse ecosystem of CPU and multi-GPU architectures, to what I think of as kind of the last phase, and that previous phase is not done, but the last phase is to really make the codes what we call GPU resident. Because if you do these things sort of halfway, you don't realize anything close to the potential of the platforms. So a lot of the work has gone into having, minimizing the communication between the host and the GPU, and finding new ways to move data to the GPU, move computation to the GPU, and keep it there for a long time. Okay, so I consider those two the current focus of where we are right now. All right, and I will say one more thing about how we measure progress. And I think people are familiar with the idea of a figure of merit. Each application project has its own figure of merit that was rigorously vetted by pretty much everybody that has an opinion. And we track throughout the course of the project the ratio of the current best FOM, whatever system they achieved it on, to their baseline, which was their entry point to the project on systems like Titan and the Blue Gene system at Argonne and Cori and so forth. And I'll point out that based off of results on Summit, and when we say extrapolated here, a lot of the teams could not run on the full system. So it is an optimistic extrapolation, assuming they scale perfectly, which is not at all the case typically, but it just gave us some sense of what the potential could be. So I point out that we have 6 that on Summit were able to surpass their FOM already. Doesn't mean they can easily surpass it on the exascale architectures. There could be a step back before you take 2 steps forward. A lot of them have not gotten over that bar of 50 yet. And we have 13 other applications that are not explicitly measured by an FOM, which have a lot of work to do. Okay, so I don't want this to seem overly optimistic, but I think we made surprising progress, and there are lots of stories to tell, and they're told in the annual report on what we did on the Summit and similar architectures. Okay, so that's just sort of all by way of preview. Now I want to talk about the fun part, which is what has been so difficult and what are the major challenges in everything we've done to this point and what we still have to do. Okay, and I kind of group them into 4 categories. So I make 4 points that kind of underlie the story that I want to tell. The first I kind of said, which is over a 7-year period, in all of these domain fields, there are a lot of changes. People develop new methodologies, people add new physical models. Oftentimes when you get on a larger machine, you justify, or the use case for the extra computing power is an additional physical model, not necessarily more particles or a finer grid, right? So lots of, and how you implement this particular new physical model might not be well established in the community. So there are a lot of moving parts that require people with very different expertise to work together. Of course, GPU hardware is in a sense general purpose, but like all hardware, it has preferred computational motifs, and not everything is a perfect natural fit for GPU hardware. I'll talk about that in a second. Programming models, analysis tools, application building blocks take a long time to mature. Okay, they require broad community buy-in. In a lot of cases, there's co-design between the people designing the software at all levels and the people who use it. And that feedback process takes a long time to harden. And the expertise is not unlimited. I mean, these are highly specialized researchers and practitioners who are very valued, and there are only so many of them. So I guess the point is that when you get a new system, and people at facilities tell me this is normal, but maybe I didn't anticipate the degree to which it is really a long, arduous process that directly impacts what we're doing. And then there's the question of sort of application level libraries. So if you are using Trilinos or PETSI or Hypera as sort of the core solver for your application, they need to be ported. The particular piece of them that you want to use has to be efficiently ported to the GPU, which might be a research project in itself, at the same time that you are advancing, developing new things in your application, and how those line up and what you can depend on and how from a project standpoint you manage those relationships. It's turned out to be one of the more difficult and more interesting parts of the project at a high level. Okay, so the fact that you have all these interacting parts can be very complicated. So it's just a reminder, although most people are aware of this, but I'm going to show computational motifs that are not necessarily ideally suited for GPUs. So on a GPU, we think of codes doing very well kind of automatically that first obviously expose massive amounts of fine-grained parallelism. It is, very efficient fine-grained hardware multi-threading that allows fine-grained parallelism to be scheduled very efficiently. So you need to, as a starting point, have something like 10 times the number I listed for the number of simultaneous floating point operations you can even do on an architecture like Summit. You need to expose massive amounts, and sometimes that means finding totally new axes of parallelism that were never used before in your particular domain. They do best on codes that can be made GPU resident. Okay, so in other words, you don't want flat performance profiles, or if you do, it takes a long time once you knock down, one of the components to then work on the next, most time-consuming one. So, how much back and forth you need and how concentrated your performance bottlenecks are really affect how long this process takes. And we see lots of examples of that. Codes that operate in the weak scaling versus the strong scaling regime. So, we have codes that want to do things like speed up computational fluid dynamics, but not necessarily run a finer grid. And that means you sort of thin the problem out on each node. And that weighs against the first thing I said, which is you want, GPUs have what we call, I guess now they call it a value of n sub 0.8. But anyhow, it's the idea of the sort of threshold problem at which the threshold problem is large enough to come close to optimally using the resources. And anything on a CPU, it's much higher than it is on a GPU. And a few of our projects have great examples, maybe 5 or 6 of them have great examples of that. So there are things that people do algorithmically to work around that, but it takes time, it takes a lot of thought and effort. Like CPU's high arithmetic intensity, that one's sort of obvious. Obviously, we need, if we don't have SIMDization, then we have a lot of branching logic, then we have to deal with divergence, and that erodes performance. Of course, we're sort of forced to some degree in a strong scaling regime because the number of flops per storage has gone way up. And so you don't automatically get more work to do because you have a bigger footprint of data. So you have to keep that in mind. And then we see the beginning of specialized instructions, and we'll probably see more of that. But for now, I think about the tensor cores. So what about when these conditions aren't met? So I want to talk a little about, at a high level, some exemplars where this isn't so easy. Okay, so let me introduce 4 case studies, starting with the Exabiome project. Our exascale computational tools for metagenomics, which is a very exciting, relatively new field of bioinformatics. Endless scientific frontiers. A lot of it depends on the software and of how reliably you can do how large a problem. So the PI is Kathy Yellick at Berkeley and LBL. And I list the main stakeholder agency as BCR just because I want to emphasize that those relationships are very important. And I think the idea it's kind of mind-boggling, but probably well depicted with just a shovel of dirt. So if you take a shovel of dirt or a bucket of lake water or some bark from a tree or whatever, and you want to know what's in it. Well, the microbial communities can have hundreds of different species, maybe even 1,000 different species in them. And it's hard to isolate them, but with new gene sequencing technology, lower cost, faster rate, you can do reads of the genomic sequence of the microbes that are in whatever sample you want to look at. And what you get is kind of like, you know, the pieces of 100 different puzzles, some of which are torn, many of which are missing, with no photo saying what the puzzle looks like, all strewn all over the place. You have to try to piece them together. You know, one of the challenges is you have very low concentrations of some microbes and very high concentrations of other. It's a really hard computing problem. And the DNAs, if you're just talking about de novo sequencing, like you don't have anything, any reference to compare it to, and you want to figure out what are the likely microbial species in the sample that you're looking at. And you get reads, and reads for certain technical reasons are sort of a fixed length, and you have to start putting all these reads together, okay? And the way you do it is you sort of chop them up into these fixed length substrings called contigs, and then you build a scaffolding, and you do lots of sequence matching, and you build a big de Bruijn graph, and you do an Eulerian walk on a de Bruijn graph, and it's just very complicated and very computationally intensive. Okay, what I want to emphasize here, rather than going through the steps of the algorithm, is that there are a few major challenges to doing this, and sort of why exascale machines and people with computational expertise can have such a big impact on this field. First, the methods themselves aren't robust. Okay, so it's not just like you know exactly the steps that you're going to perform, and now you just have to put them on an exascale machine. The methods depend on, for example, whether there's technology to do longer sequence reads, or what the error rates might be in the reads. You might try a totally different approach. There are 2 or 3 very common approaches. The heuristics that you use, because the problems are computationally tractable, change. People come up with new things. Verification is very difficult. So if you could do the largest assembly ever, and it might be hard to say something about how good it is. So these methods are evolving at the same time that the codes are evolving, the software is evolving, and the hardware is evolving. And some of the computational motifs are not an ideal fit for GPUs. So I'll just give a couple of examples in this case. There are components that are used to do various aspects of this problem. So it's not just assembly. It's also things like protein clustering, okay? And a lot of them have, you know, sort of, I would say, non-standard HPC and certainly non-standard GPU underlying computational patterns. So I'll point to hash tables, sorting, certain graph operations, and alignment as things that are very difficult to simply run on a GPU or multi-GPU system and get the kind of speed up that you would get with something like dense linear algebra, or just grid-based applications or particle-based applications that have patterns that are a better natural fit. So it takes a lot of work. And I'll just give a couple of examples that I've seen in talks from Kathy. One of them is for doing sequence alignment. Okay, so the goal here, this is an underlying component of different aspects of the problem, but the idea is you want to find when 2 DNA sequences are a close match to each other. And there's a famous algorithm called Smith-Waterton, which is a dynamic programming problem, which is very expensive. And the question is, can you speed it up on a GPU? And the Exabiome project built a tool called Adept, which was designed to do exactly that. There's a very long story about all the things they tried, successes and failures. And I'm just going to sort of show where they are now. And you could still argue there's potentially a ways to go. If you look at red, yellow, and green, those are 2, 4, and 6 GPU results. And you want the number to be higher because these are measured in gigacell updates per second. Okay. And the light blue and the dark blue are 2 general purpose sequence alignment algorithms that run on CPUs. One is called SSW and one is called Sequin. Okay. And, you know, it's always with GPUs hard to know exactly what a fair comparison is, right? So it depends on if you're concerned with, you know, per energy or per cost or whatever. But these are run on 32 Haswell cores. Okay, so you see eventually, and you could read in this paper all of the work they did to get to this point, but you see eventually, if you do a node to node comparison, at least, they were able to get significant speed up, and the stories and the work behind it, I think, are really intriguing. And same when you look at these, same problem for doing alignment with proteins. There are sequencers which take advantage of particular subclasses of applications that might be faster, but they're interested in general purpose. Okay, so that's just sort of a flavor of the kind of results and kind of thing they're working on. And then they looked at plugging this into MetaHitmer. So here's MetaHitmer with one of the existing CPU-based alignment tools, and the Smith-Waterman portion, which is what SW stands for. Sort of the time was reduced when they plugged in the adept code from what you see here to this piece right here. It also underscores all of the components that have to be optimized in order to bring the total amount of time way down. And then similarly for this protein similarity graph construction pipeline called pastis. So these are components that can be plugged into different codes that do different aspects of the problem, but this shows in both cases the amount of time saved from each. So anyhow, I find that really interesting algorithm for porting from CPUs to GPUs, sort of a good story and how it can be very complicated. Here's another example, which is just counting k-mers. So k-mers are these fixed length strings of a specified amount, and one of the fundamental operations is being able to count them, and there are a lot, and you use distributed hash tables. Okay, so distributed hash tables are difficult to implement efficiently on CPUs. I know Kathy gave us a talk at the review last year, and there was just a lot of trial and error and new ideas. And eventually they sort of came up with this idea of having these supermers, which are, I guess, strings of k-mers put together that reduce the communication time to be able to do lookups across nodes. And there's a paper on this also that goes into some of the details. But when they compare to a 42 core per node CPU, they're able to achieve speedups with sort of an optimal size of the supermer that is significant. Okay, but again, really pushing the frontiers of what these architectures can be used for, with a lot of algorithmic innovation and lots of new ideas, taking a long time in the project. These aren't just obvious ports. So let me switch to another one now. I find this a really exciting application area. This is simply using diffraction patterns from light sources to be able to map the structure of complex molecules. Okay, and this particular project is called XFEL, FEL standing for the free electron laser. So that happens to be the light source that this project is focused on, but we think of this as sort of a more general exemplar for the integration of facilities data analysis with high performance computing. And the PI is Amadeo Perazzo at SLAC. And we think of this as sort of being a BES application. I just show here the structure of different proteins, complex molecules. Let me give a little background if you're not used to this kind of thing. The free electron laser is it's a light source that has incredibly fast, incredibly intense light bursts. So they're like femtos, several femtoseconds long. And it's different in that sense from a synchrotron in that it's got many orders of magnitude higher brilliance, and it's much shorter. And it enables different kinds of applications. So you might not need you can have a very small crystal, I call them nanocrystals, or you might even be able to avoid crystallizing something altogether. Okay, and it requires many samples of the small crystal you're looking at, and you take diffraction patterns from maybe tens of thousands of these samples, and you use them with very complex algorithms to try to reconstruct the structure of the molecule that you're looking at. And already it takes a long time after you do the initial experiments to be able to put together a reconstruction of the image. But what I have in the bottom left here is the key point, is that the LCLS2 upgrade will increase data throughput by 3 orders of magnitude. Okay, so sort of at a point now where while their goal is to be able to steer these experiments by getting real-time feedback based off of reconstructions of diffraction patterns, now the gap is growing even further from that, because the data rate, which I'll show on the next slide some details of, has increased so significantly. Okay, so this project is really trying to push the frontiers using exascale machines of how fast you can get feedback and how accurately you can do these reconstructions. So there are many things happening at one time. One, they're trying to do very significant improvements to, maybe it's a 10-year-old method, but it's still more the standard method, the serial femtosecond crystallography. Okay, and that's their challenge problem. And they have an interesting new way of doing it to get much more accurate data, but they also want to be able to do it much, much faster so that experimental teams can guide, because it's very obviously expensive to be able to use the light source. So they want to be able to guide the direction of their experiments by feedback that they get as they're getting diffraction patterns and seeing what they can learn from them. So they have a novel way of doing this, which kind of solves a minimization problem. So they're trying to do a optimization problem against a model. I'll talk about that in a second. But there's a new technique, and this is, the details aren't so important as sort of understanding the landscape, which is that, recently people have developed ways of doing single particle imaging. And that opens up the possibility of not having to crystallize something, which opens up many new scientific frontiers. And the particular algorithm that they're looking at is called MTIP. But at the same time, they're trying to see if they can accelerate it on these exascale systems. At the same time, they're trying to create a data pipeline between the computational facility and the experimental facility. They're also trying to understand what they can get out of this algorithm. So it's an incredibly complicated number of moving parts, but in the end, they want to enable real-time end-to-end workflows. Okay, so it's incredibly exciting. And again, I emphasize that we see this as like an exemplar. So we have a close eye on them, but some of what they develop and a lot of the methodology hopefully will lead the way more broadly, including with the synchrotron light sources. Okay, so I won't go into a lot of depth here, but I'll say their grand challenge on the left is enabling new photon science from the LCLS with real-time analysis, which will require something like an exaflop of computing. Okay, so it seemed, when I first heard this, it seemed almost fantastical to me, but how far they've come makes me realize that not only is it realistic, it's actually not that far away. So what are I put on the right the computational challenges, because that's really what I'm emphasizing, which is, okay, what do these architectures do for a problem like this? Well, they have a complex multi-component workflow, and they have to get data quickly from the facility to the computation, to the supercomputer. That's difficult enough in itself. They are considering exploring moving from these serial femtosecond crystallography algorithms to single particle imaging algorithms. So now you're exploring kind of an algorithmic space independent of GPUs. Well, if you look at MTIP, a lot of the performance is based off of non-uniform FFTs. Well, non-uniform FFTs is not something that you have an optimized library on GPUs that to perform off the shelf. So this actually launched a project with one of our FFT co-design centers, what's actually within our COBA co-design center, to explore algorithms for optimizing non-uniform FFTs on GPUs exactly for this project. There are also improved algorithms for doing SFX, which require maximum likelihood estimation. It's sort of like a nonlinear sparse optimization loop. And they have progress, but again, it's not the kind of thing that you just easily port to a GPU. There's a lot of fundamental work on how you can reformulate these things to take advantage. And they have two recent papers, one for MTIP and one for SFX, and what the strategies are for porting and optimizing these on GPU systems. Okay, so what I really want to emphasize isn't all of the details. I certainly don't know them all myself, but it is how complex a landscape it is, how exciting the science is, how many moving parts there are, and how the sort of exascale machine is one piece of it, but other things are kind of swirling around it. So I will say then, just with one result, that for the MTIP algorithm, where they're doing single particle reconstruction, which, I was just talking to Nicholas Sauter the other day, and there's just a lot that's not known about it, right? There's not known how well it will work, or but there's a lot of promise. Anyhow, so with the computational engine are these non-uniform FFTs, and they're able to get some non-trivial speed up on the GPU for their best library compared to the CPU, but there's a lot of work to be done. And we're hoping that their collaboration with a co-design center will have a huge impact on this. Okay, let me say something. Let's see if I have time. Yeah, I have a little bit more time about power grid simulation. Okay, so this is the EXA-SGD project, exascale computational tools for the power grid. Totally, different and far more refined way of modeling the impact of node failures in power grids, and particularly we're interested in the U.S. power grids. The PI is Slav Peles at PNNL, and the main agency stakeholder is OE. So I think the simplest way to think of this is you have all sorts of contingency scenarios that you have to worry about when you're operating the power grid, and it becomes a computationally intractable problem to think of all possible combinations of failures and what you would do to mitigate the failures. So, for example, often if you have a failure of a power generation source, you might have a redundant power generation source, and you might be able to swap that in. If you don't, you might have to have a brownout. You might have to decide how you're going to selectively shut the power off in certain places to avoid under frequency, okay, which can cause all sorts of problems. So the idea is that the current technologies are based off of a lot of heuristics and a lot of models, and they propose building a massive computational optimization problem where they can look at what are so-called n-k scenarios, and ultimately, just like with the free electron source problem, in the sort of 10-minute time scale, give real-time feedback to grid operators about how to optimally solve these problems. So one problem in particular that we negotiated with the Office of Electricity was the under-frequency load shedding problem as a major application driver and the real-time control of it. Okay, so you want to keep the frequency right as close to 60 hertz as possible. As you start losing power generation, you start going under that, and you have to selectively decide the optimal strategy to bring things back into balance. Okay, well, that's it's a really interesting application. It's incredibly complex. Underneath the hood, this is a massive nonlinear optimization problem. Okay, and so it brings major computational challenges. It's laid out computationally as massive, sparse, indefinite linear systems. And one thing they found out early, after doing a comprehensive survey of everything that was available in the sort of mathematical library space, that there are not optimized GPU solvers for indefinite systems with positive and negative eigenvalues. And they switched then their approach. And I guess the main thing I want to emphasize is it's very complicated, right? They completely went from sort of where they expected to be to algebraic compression into dense systems of equations that were more amenable to the GPU. So the hardware and what the hardware does best kind of guided their decision and how to reformulate their systems. And they were able to go very far with this. So I'll just sort of show, obviously not going to look at the details of the slide, but they went through this compression process to a system that was more appropriate for GPUs and got a significant fraction of GPU peak performance. And we're able to do some huge problems, unprecedented scale problems. But it turned out that when they went to do a larger problem, the compression approach was still too expensive. So what compression does, it's still n cubed, but it kind of moves you out. So you can do bigger system sizes at lower total number of floating point operations, right? But the scaling is much better for the sparse systems. So they realized that to be able to do the really big problems, they were going to need an efficient sparse non-definite solver. And so that created a collaboration between this project and our math libraries projects that we just funded out of contingency recently to explore optimized indefinite sparse solvers on GPUs. Okay, it's a joint effort between both of them, and it's driven by this particular application, but it's a capability that will hopefully exist generally and serve other applications as well. And these often occur in optimization problems. All right, so I don't have too much more time, so I'll just point out that they were able to do some large problems and get some modest speed up on GPUs, but they're continuing to push forward. A hard problem. I'll just say one more. The design of nuclear reactors is a little bit more of a traditional HPC field, but I just want to show how difficult it can be when we think about taking things and moving them from CPUs to GPUs. This is by Steve Hamilton at Oak Ridge. And the goal is to be able to model at the pin level the isotopics and the power within a small modular reactor, which are reactors that you can, you can build them in a factory and you can ship them somewhere. So they became popular again about a decade ago. But anyhow, this is unique because it is coupling Monte Carlo methods for doing very detailed neutron transport with deterministic computational fluid dynamic methods. In this case, it's spectral element methods. Okay, and so the challenges are, how do you do Monte Carlo on GPUs? Monte Carlo is very parallel, but it's very MIMD. It's not very SIMD. Every particle takes its own path and undergoes its own interactions according to probabilistically what happens. And coupling Monte Carlo and CFD is a big computational challenge. And then strong scaling CFD, because we know the problem size we want to do it much faster. And there are limiting returns to just cranking up the resolution of the mesh because there's a little subgrid modeling anyhow. And we know how to model the wall effects pretty well. So when you put it all together, I think of these as like the three major computational challenges. And it turns out, I'll just say it quickly, that this required a radical shift in how you do Monte Carlo methods. There used to be a history-based method where every single neutron was tracked from birth until absorption one by one. And of course, if there are billions of them, you can do as many as you want in parallel because they don't interact with each other. And that does not work on a GPU. That does not work particularly well. You can do it, but you get lots of branch divergence. So they switched to an event-based approach. Okay, with the event-based approach, you actually have to do sorting, and you sort at every step from one interaction to the next, particles based off of the type of interaction they're undergoing. And then they all have the same operator applied to them. And because they have the same operator applied, that can be posed as like a warp, a SIMD instruction. And I never thought this was going to work, although this was proposed back in the 70s for vector machines. I never saw it work particularly well. Anyhow, so I'll just sort of make a long story short. They were able, for their Monte Carlo code on Summit, to get an FOM ratio of 23, extrapolated 26, which is phenomenal speed up. Doesn't get them over 50 yet. In fact, they need a geometric mean, a harmonic mean, sorry, of their CFD and their Monte Carlo in order to hit their FOM. So they're still a little under the 50. And there's a lot of work to be done currently on Frontier, but they made huge progress. But the code is completely rewritten because I mean the whole code is one big loop over neutrons, so it had to be kind of turned inside out. So I think I'm just about running out of time. I will say one interesting thing. There are a lot of applications beyond small modular reactors, and this project actually catalyzed a new collaboration between ASCAC and high energy physics to apply these same tools modified to charge particle tracking and something called the Celeritas project. Okay. All right. So I think I think I kind of ran out of time. I can maybe just jump to my conclusions really quickly. I will say that there are probably to a lot of people, a lot of familiar issues with taking new systems and using either higher level libraries or higher level programming models, and the amount of time it takes those to mature to the level that people might have been accustomed to, even say on NVIDIA systems. But I will point you to the annual report where I pulled out a number of themes that I think are worth considering. And I'll just say my final thoughts and then I'll stop talking. So first, it's very hard to push the frontiers in this way alone. We have very broad collaborations of extremely diverse teams. It's been the best thing to witness. I could have never imagined that aspect of it going so well. And I'm a real evangelist for people working together with different types of expertise, because that's how so much progress is made. That includes the adoptions of libraries and enabling tools, and includes the co-design of application level libraries. So it's people and tools. I'll say hardware and programming models drive methods, models, and algorithms as much as the reverse. I did not expect that. So when people see what the hardware looks like, they suddenly think very differently about the next thing they want to model or the algorithm they want to use to model the thing that they're modeling. I emphasize that ECP is not just about porting and benchmarks. They're innovations at all levels with a very subtle interplay among the different levels. And that's what makes it very, very exciting and very complicated, okay? And something, and being Captain Obvious, software takes a long time to mature on new systems, and we're in the throes of that right now. So we're making progress fast, but we still have a long way to go. And I guess I'll leave it there. And if any of my other points are of interest to anyone, I guess you can ask me offline. So thanks.
Thanks, Andrew, for a really thoughtful talk. I think Martin Berzins may have a question.
Hi, Andrew. Great talk. Could you say something, you talked obviously about the challenges of GPUs. Could you say something about how you intend to meet the challenges of sort of being on multiple GPUs, with, you have very different programming models and so on. I mean, there seems to be some attempt at standardizing on things like SYCL and so on. I mean, is that the way that you see this running in terms of managing movement between CPUs and GPUs, for example?
Not necessarily, no. So right now, that ecosystem is sorting itself out in a very lively way. Okay, so if I just threw up a slide right now on the right, where we look at the distribution of choices people are making for programming models on that's sort of their first choice on the exascale systems. We have about 6 or 7 applications that are kind of all in on Pragma models, and that mostly means OpenMP. And I've identified that as a significant risk because we don't know much, at least in my opinion, about OpenMP offload, especially on these new machines, but they really want portability and they want, I guess, minimum interference in some ways with their code. A lot of people have adopted these kind of third-party application level, portable, I don't know what you call them, languages like Cocos and Raja are very popular in our project. And people are using HIP and CUDA, and a lot of people are just sweeping it to the co-design centers or to the libraries. So there's really everything. I wish I could say I could pick a winner, but we're in that stage right now where this is really kind of self-organizing. I will say I worry about OpenMP. I mean, you didn't say OpenMP, you said SYCL. I don't know what to say about, that we'll see. It's a long way to go before that becomes a reality, but who am I to say? But I'm worried about OpenMP.
Well, OpenMP at least looks to have the potential to run pretty well on Aurora in some ways. And the reason I mentioned SYCL, because clearly you have an established NVIDIA kind of ecosystem, but the ecosystem for Aurora and for Frontier is less well defined, and there needs to be some attempt to achieve sort of portable performance across those architectures, and that needs more than just Cocos and Raja and OpenMP, in fact. So there needs to be some sort of standardization process at some level to achieve that in a way that, it's not so different from where we were with MPI a long time ago, 30 years ago. We have to move to a means of somehow getting portable performance across those different GPU architectures if they're going to be used for real going forward.
Yeah, and so there's one sort of, and in this project, we don't explicitly measure portability, but everyone cares about that as their #1 concern. And so it's kind of an interesting dichotomy, right? Our project metrics require you to roll up your sleeves and hit your FOM, but the PIs don't think about it that way for the reasons that you say. They put performance portability as a top priority. So hopefully we'll do both, but we don't know the answers yet.
All right. Ben has a question, and then we should probably move on.
Thanks very much. That's a really thought-provoking talk. One of the things that's popped up with open source libraries is that everybody thinks that all the bugs have been found because it's open source, and we all know that it's the opposite. Is there a regular practice in the high performance computing community of doing something to validate the open source libraries that are used?
Not enough.
Not enough.
There's never enough. I know people who spend their life on exactly that issue. So I think I could speak very generally. The good open source libraries like the math libraries, for example, have lots of verification problems built in, and some cases up to 100. Other things are just much more boutique and much less well engineered, so that's a big problem actually, because the scientific programmer above everything else wants to believe their result, right? Yeah. And so if you're at all mistrusting of the correctness of something and can't in any way verify it yourself, then it is one of the sort of 4 or 5 reasons that people are third-party software adoption hesitant. And I know everyone thinks everyone should collaborate with everyone, use everyone's stuff, but there's a lot of risk associated with it as well. And you sort of put your finger on one. Of course, just the sustainability plan, which is an obvious one, is another one. And, I can think of a few others off the top of my head, but yeah, that's why people often use libraries of people who they collaborate with and who they trust. That's the sociology of it. That's a good question, though. Not prepared to fully answer it.
Well, thank you for trying. I appreciate it.
That's a polite way, Andrew, of saying it's important to know which neck to wring if it doesn't work. I will say there will be some interesting panels at the upcoming SC21 conference about these issues of HPC and reproducibility and some of the scientific ethics questions around what it means to do reproducible computational science. So that might be interesting as well. But thanks, Andrew. I echo what others have said. That was a really thoughtful talk. So really appreciate that.
Okay, thank you.
In our last talk today, Rob Ross has been waiting patiently and is going to talk about data demands.
Sure, why not?
So, all right, Rob, go for it.
Okay, so I've got a little time here at the end of the day. Thank you for sticking around. So thanks for the chance to talk to ASCAC again. So that's all. This is always fun. And Jaron mentioned the Lawrence Award, and I just want to say I'm really honored to have been awarded the Lawrence in 2020. And I work with a ton of talented people in DOE, and I can only imagine who I was competing with. So it's amazing. And getting a call from Chris Fall on a Saturday morning is a sort of surreal experience. But it was a good one. So it was very nice. So today I want to talk about data, and especially data in high performance computing, and how we can do a better job of meeting science needs. And this presentation, of course, like most of us, we stand on the backs of giants. So there's a bunch of folks who've done really hard work to make this work possible, and they're listed here. So first, I'm going to go back to maybe the last time I spoke to you, and I don't expect you to remember what I said. So what I was talking about was a workshop on storage and I/O that had happened in 2018. And of course, data continues to play an important role in things. And back then, the experts at this workshop looked at what was happening in applications and saw this collection of drivers that seemed to indicate places where we needed to push on state of the art in storage and I/O and data. And what I think you see in this list actually is a reflection of the diversity and the complexity that both Ben and Andrew articulated in their talks. But sort of reflected down at the data storage level, right? Things like streaming data, many small records that we have to sort through, maybe some graph or unstructured data, random access, fine-grained sharing, and real-time sort of things like that. All just very interesting challenges that are different than what we were accustomed to seeing in sort of the simulation era, right? But I think more importantly to my team, this emphasized not just the diversity of the types of data, which you can see, but also the methods and the patterns of access. And so we believed, and we continue to believe, that there's really no one size fits all here. And we had spent some time banging our heads against trying to build something that kind of works for everything. But as we continued to dig into this, we came to the conclusion that maybe the right answer was to have a collection, an ecosystem of services, and how could we help make that possible? And so that's what I'm going to talk about for about the first half of this talk. So I'm going to talk about bespoke data services, this Mochi project that Jaron introduced back earlier in the day. And so when I talk about a data service, what I mean is some third-party software, so code outside of the application that's managing data on behalf of the users. And things like file systems and databases are examples of data services, but also things like email servers are examples of data services that have, very obviously very different data models, very different interfaces, and very different underlying organizations on the backside that make them work well for the situations they're meant to be used in. So the Mochi project is a project that is OSCAR R&D funded and then also has some support from ECP and from SIDAC. And just to restate what Jaron mentioned earlier, Mochi is about exploring how one builds bespoke services in HPC, and not just how one would build a bespoke service or a few bespoke services, but to come up with patterns and a methodology for building these things more easily and increasing the reusability. And so when we look at this diagram, it's meant to sort of get across the idea that there's a methodology here where on the sort of the left-hand side, we work with the science teams, kind of clean slate and co-design what the model of the data looks like, how they'd like to interact with this thing through interfaces in the middle. And then from there, then we can sit down and say, okay, well, what should the architecture of this service look like? And what are the components that go into that service? What are the microservices that go into that service? And in some sense, we see this as similar to making sure that you've selected the right algorithm for your code, right? And so looking back on Andrew's talk a minute ago, when you move from one platform to another with very different technologies or very different scales, the algorithm you were using before might not be appropriate anymore. And I think we've been seeing that in spades in HPC as people move to greater scales and new platforms and new problems, where sort of the file systems that we've seen in the past are no longer really holding up their end of the bargain. So when we look at this project, to us, success would be an ecosystem of data services that use this stuff, built not just by us, but a whole community of different people, like-minded computer scientists, and with people using them not because they like me or because they think it'll draw some recognition to their project, but because the services are easier to build, they're easier to use, they're faster or more scalable, and hopefully more reliable. Getting to Vince's point earlier about open source software, the reusability here, we think touches on that. So just to sort of boil that, dive in on what the components are. I think the most important thing to say is that the team is looking across a variety of different fields as we think about this problem. And so there are some components that look very familiar to an HPC person. So, portable communication, user level threading for concurrency, different language bindings, things like that, right? Those are things that we're all accustomed to. But then there are others that maybe aren't necessarily seen in HPC, but might be seen in distributed computing, such as group membership, strong group membership, or eventual group membership, that sort of thing, that allows you to build more robust services. And then additionally, from cloud computing, we've adopted or sort of adapted concepts in provisioning and also a variety of different microservices that we see in the cloud, from various different kinds of key value and document stores and things like that, and also things that look a little bit like DHTs. So this is the kind of tools that we see as being the common building blocks that one uses in these services. And then what you do is you say, okay, well, we're missing a service that does streaming data. So why don't we build that in this particular case? That's a few thousand lines of code, and we'll incorporate that with other pieces to build something that works as a whole. So one example is this service called DeltaFS that was built by our Carnegie Mellon collaborators. And in this example, the challenge is to enable a very specific analysis, which is to capture particle tracks for particles of interest, but you don't know which particles you're interested in ahead of time, and there are going to be trillions of them. And so it's sort of a big, it could be treated as kind of a big out of course sort, right? But that as we know, is not maybe a very efficient process. And so what they wanted to do was to find a way to, at runtime, do some work that allowed these queries to go very fast. In this particular case, the scientists were perfectly happy, and in fact, seemed to be prefer the idea that well, why don't we just create a trillion files where each file has the track of an individual particle. And if you've ever tried anything like that on a file system, standard file system, that doesn't work. But what the Carnegie Mellon team was able to do was to build a service that presents something that looks like a file system, but in fact shuffles writes during runtime and uses a component out of Google LevelDB on the back end to manage that data, such that the queries after the fact, when that job is done, are 3 or more orders of magnitude faster than they were before. And it's a relatively modest additional time during runtime. And so now they can look at particles of interest. They can change their mind about what particles they're interested in, et cetera. And this is very different way of interacting with the data than it would have been had they had to post-process that data. Second example comes out of high energy physics, and this is a SciDAC activity. In this case, the service was built with this neutrino experiment, looking at the properties of neutrinos and antineutrinos. It's called NOVA in mind. And the data has a structure of runs and subruns and events, sort of a language for talking about the data that the physicists are accustomed to. And the data itself is detector output and associated derived information, sometimes annotated during workflow execution, analysis workflow execution. And in this case, what the service is doing is caching information inside the platform to enable rapid analysis. So the very low latency, like point queries, event queries into this service. And so what the eventual goal is to stack up, in fact, multiple user workflows and allow them all to hit this thing at one time. So dramatically accelerate how analysis is done for this NOVA experiment. Here too, we get the file system out of the way by just bulk ingesting things, which we know file systems are good at. And then it ends up looking like a very special in-memory key value store, right? Which, conceptually isn't very complicated, but it's stitched in very nicely with a nice C++ interface into this art analysis toolkit that our physicists are very happy to interact with and to use. And we're already beginning to look at this using this same service in another project called Icarus, another HEP project, which has a more complex workflow. And I think it'll be interesting to see how we can extend this, sort of incrementally to serve this, multi-step workflow using very similar functionality. So there have been a lot of other services built with Mochi at this point. And those include object stores and document stores and streaming data systems and in situ data analysis and more. We have 2 industry partners that we're very excited about. So Intel is using some of our components in the Deos object store that'll be part of Aurora, and Kitware, who many people know from PairView and VTK, is in a phase 2 SBIR project looking at these tools as a way to potentially build the next generation of tools like PairView. Users are adopting this stuff because we've spent a lot of time on tuning and making it as robust as we can, so it's high performance. We're portable across all the different network interfaces that we're seeing in the HPC world right now, which helps a lot also. And because customization is easy with these tools. We're getting good feedback, and I would say we're not to that vision of an ecosystem of data services, but we're getting there. We're on our way, and so it's been very satisfying. So with that said, I'm going to switch topics, and I'm going to talk a little bit about looking ahead. But before I do that, I'm actually going to take a step back to 2018. So the other set of drivers that we were thinking about back in 2018. So on the application side, I think actually our application drivers, we did a pretty good job of not prognosticating. Technology drivers, maybe not as much. So we noticed some trends, blurring of storage and memory. Okay, maybe some more faults, maybe not. Deeper storage hierarchy. I'm not sure that's really But in particular, we missed at least two key things. One is we as a community had no idea how impactful non-volatile memory really was going to be, and especially how complicated it was going to be to truly exploit it. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And we were also very skeptical that smart devices would appear anytime soon. Now, if you're a storage researcher, you've been seeing smart devices appear in the literature off and on since, I don't know, maybe the 90s. And they've never really gotten much of anywhere. You know, they're anecdotal, you know, database accelerators and things like that. But it felt like a safe bet at the time to say, well, these smart devices are neat, but they're not going to happen. And I think that we were wrong about that. And I'll talk about why I think that's important. So first, let's talk about IOPS. So IOPS are input-output operations per second, and they are a way of talking about performance for storage and memory and networking. In HPC, we have typically talked about storage in terms of a rate, you know, megabytes per second, gigabytes per second, terabytes per second. But what we're seeing, a lot of those trends from applications, random accesses, real-time, point queries, graph, those are all IOP dependent, all of them. And so great, because we have these devices that, you know, in the upper right-hand corner, 300 nanoseconds to grab a random read out of an Optane memory device. That's fast. That's crazy fast. You know, in terms of where we've gotten over the last few decades. But even at our best in Mochi and in services like Orion out of UC San Diego, this is in the right hand. This is Steve Swanson's group. This is cutting edge stuff, and this was published in 2019, I think, with his Orion system. And you can see that's you know, another 5 microseconds, something like that. You know, so factor of 10 off of what the device is supposed to be able to do. That's not great, right? We don't need to leave a magnitude on the floor. You know, Dan was joking about what's an 8x among friends. Well, in an IOPS workload, it matters, right? And so we really need to think about how to better use these devices, and I think it means we've got to think about, you know, fundamentally what our architectures look like and how we can get as much software as possible out of the fast paths, which has not been the tradition in storage at all. And so smart devices come in, and I think where smart devices maybe, so first of all, what is a smart device? A smart device is a storage device. It's really kind of a memory storage hybrid. Typically, you can see an example from Samsung over here, and this particular one has a Xilinx capability built into it. And the idea is that you can put some compute capability right next to the device, cut latency, and we've seen these in HPC before, more on NICs, for example. So we see, you know, hardware acceleration of collectives, for example. That's something that we've seen successful. I think, and when people look at these, oftentimes they think, oh, well, how can I take some piece of my application and push it out there? But I think more fundamentally, what might be interesting for us is to think about how can we turn a smart device into a microservice by using these capabilities, and what complexity of microservices can we build using these kind of devices, and then how would we integrate that into a more comprehensive service that's oriented towards particular use cases in DOE science. And then finally, coming back to Mochi as a project, I think we also have an opportunity to emulate, you know, potential devices and rapidly just explore in a very co-design, you know, manner. To really understand how these devices might work, because anybody who's done emulation knows that 10x, although it's not good in production, is not bad for an emulator. So if we have to go 10x slower, but we can get a feel for things, that's not maybe a bad place to be. So you might have been thinking, well, why has there not been an AI slide in this talk? It seems like that's the thing to do right now. Yeah, so here it is. So there are a lot of ways that machine learning and AI can benefit from and also can be beneficial to data services. This on the right is a really simple example. What we're doing is taking, adapting this Deep Hyper tool that Prasanna Balaprakash has developed with others. He's one of the early career folks that I think got highlighted earlier. And we're using it to explore the configuration space for data services. So when you go to deploy a workflow plus a data service, there are questions like, how many nodes do I need for each of these things? And how much memory should I hand to this device? And should I be busy polling or should I not? And how many cores should I allocate to which? And the configuration spaces are just way too complicated for humans to do a good job. And so what we've been doing is letting this tool for hyperparameter search loose on the problem. It builds a surrogate model and does a very good job of exploring the space. And then to take it a step further, we've figured out how to apply transfer learning so that we can take results from small scale parameter sweeps and parameter sweeps with only fractions of the workload and apply those to complete workflows into larger scale runs. And in doing so, get our search times even down even further and use fewer resources in the process, which has been nice because this is not the most fun part of this kind of work, right? Tuning these things. So kind of coming to the conclusion of this talk, which is good because we're coming to the conclusion of our time. Sometimes it feels like data research happens in sort of two worlds. There's this world of bits and bytes and feeds and speeds on the left that's called storage and IO, and that's the world that my team members tend to reside in. But there's another world that's also increasingly important to HPC, which is the more like maybe the data management world that thinks about findability and all the rest of FAIR and ontologies and data stewardship and data life cycles. And it's not that those two communities don't talk, but they don't talk a lot, and not a lot has happened to bridge those. And I think it's important, maybe especially with the diversity of applications and the push on reproducibility, that we recognize that there are requirements that actually span these worlds, and that we should be thinking about how to combine technologies and ideas across these worlds, whether it's doing things with workflow to better annotate data so that the provenance moves along with the data even at scale, or smart stores that are performing some sort of analysis behind the scenes when there's free cycles on the storage side, or collaborative stores that are working to solve problems that occur, in the context that Ben was talking about, between facilities, between institutions, sharing data and looking for anomalies or helping each other maintain the resilience of data. There's a lot of different problems that we could go after there. So just to wrap up, I think I think we all know that DOE science is very demanding when it comes to data. I think there's a ton of interesting problems in this space, and it's been a real treat to work in this space for a little over 20 years now, I think, for me at least. And I look forward to hopefully continuing to do that. And I'd like to thank my program management, obviously, for sponsoring the work that I talked about here, but really my whole career is really built on ASCAR research. And a special thanks to the team who are a real treat to work with and make it easy to get up and sit in front, or in this case, stand in front of the same desk for 18 months. And thank you for your time.
Thanks, Rob. Really appreciate that. Questions for Rob? So I'll ask one. As you sort of think about what you're saying about smart devices, and if you caught our earlier conversation about test beds and prototypes, any thoughts about how we might facilitate some things there?
Yeah, I think one thing that has been nice about the ECP experience actually has been that it sort of codified how to get access to some of these early technologies at least for the ECP participants, right? And that has made a big difference for folks. And I do think, I do think that considering how to build a storage and also networking oriented component into these test beds would be an important facet. Oftentimes the test beds are not that interesting to us until the networking works and until some devices are there that we can write things to, right? So I think having those pieces as part of the earliest installments can make a big difference. I don't know if that really answers your question, but
yeah, no,
I guess just yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Other questions for Rob? Looks like there's a question in the chat.
Yeah. So thanks, Lynn. Challenges related to bridging the two worlds. So I think one of the challenges is just language, honestly, which is silly because we're all computer scientists. But when a storage person thinks about provenance, they're not necessarily thinking about the same thing that a data management person might consider as provenance. And so I think we have to almost kind of go back to the starting board in the same way that we would with domain scientists and just have a conversation about what it is that we mean, right? And what do we think the priorities are, and then how can we move forward from there? I hope that the storage and IO community has algorithms and architectures and scaling ways to contribute to problems that they just haven't paid as close attention to. And I hope that the data management community will help us find some creative solutions to some of the reproducibility and other fair challenges that we know DOE scientists could benefit from solutions, but the storage and IO folks maybe aren't the right people to be proposing solutions there.
All right.
How to continue that. I think we just have to, have another venue of some sort for discussion. I don't know, whatever capital W workshop or lowercase y, I don't know, but it's definitely worth more discussion.
Great. So thanks, Rob. Really appreciate it. Are there any sort of broader comments or questions from any other participants? Going once, twice. All right. Thanks, everyone. We will reconvene at the same time tomorrow and begin with talk about the COVID HPC consortium. So hope you have a great rest of the day. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow for day 2. Thanks, everyone.